Hey everyone, welcome back. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 1040. The Paragon of Reason has come. As the clan leader of the Yao clan, Yao Chongdao was immediately put into a difficult situation after the outsider sword immortal opened his mouth. This was as expected of Zuoyu. When he spoke and acted, he could very easily place others into awkward predicaments. Perhaps those innate sword talents of the majestic world 100 years ago, who had suffered crumbling sword hearts, could most empathize with Yao Chongdao's current plight. For example, the prodigious Chao Jun from the southern world continent was able to freely swing his sword back then, with the environment in his sword heart being a pond of flourishing lotuses. However, his fate was extremely miserable, and only the withered and broken remains of lotuses were left in his sword heart as he plummeted from his lofty position and became the laughing stock of the entire continent. In the end, he could only quietly make his way to the distant eastern treasured vile continent. Even until now, after more than 100 years, he was still unable to advance to the unpolished jade tier. One had to realize that Chao Jun had once been widely regarded as a 1-in-100-year prodigy in the southern world continent. Sword immortals in other areas had already detected the situation here, and smiles stretched across their faces as they got ready to enjoy a good show. Those who liked to drink had already cracked open their wine pots. They weren't ordinary spectators or sword cultivators like those on the streets, after all, and those guarding the city wall were all experienced sword immortals who had experienced more than 100 battles. As such, they naturally wouldn't shout or whistle as they watched on. Of course, part of the reason was their fear that Zuoyu would become displeased and drag them into the battle as well. Zuoyu's sword skills were far too lofty, and his sword intent was far too overwhelming. At the same time, he was also relatively unreasonable and unafraid of challenging a group of people by himself. There was a very dark expression on Yao Chongdao's face. As the clan leader of the Yao clan, the frustration and displeasure in his heart had already been accumulating for many years. Just as Yao Chongdao was about to challenge Zuoyu to a battle to the southern side of the city wall, Chen Pingan mustered his courage and started to play the peacemaker, gently putting Ning Yao down and calling Mr. Yao over, after which he asked Ning Yao to accompany Mr. Yao for a while. Meanwhile, he walked over to speak with Senior Zua. Ning Yao dragged her grandpa away for a stroll. Chen Pingan shot forward like an arrow, disappearing in a flash as he went to look for Zuoyu. Yao Chongdao's expression relaxed significantly after that touchy, ill-disciplined young man left, leaving him and his granddaughter alone. Perhaps the old man had complicated feelings about his daughter and his son-in-law, unable to properly untangle the emotions of sadness, sorrow, frustration, anger, and despondence. Toward his granddaughter, Ning Yao, however, the old man only felt pride and guilt. On the opposite city wall, Chen Pingan was no longer able to advance any closer after arriving within 10 paces of a middle-aged sword immortal who was facing the other way. Almost all of the acupoints in the sword immortal's body were brimming with abundant sword intent, making it appear as if he were treating the entire world as his opponent at every single moment. Taking a look at ordinary sword cultivators or chi refiners from the 3 teachings and 100 schools of thought, it would already be quite an achievement for them to fill their critical acupoints, where they stored their bonded items, with abundant spiritual energy and managed to slowly expand these acupoints. Chen Pingan cupped his fists after seeing Zua Yu saying in greeting, "This junior pays his respects to you, Senior Zua." Zuoyu was unmoved by Chen Pingan's arrival. Seeing this, Chen Pingan quietly walked around and jumped onto the parapet, turning around and facing Zuoyu before sitting down cross-legged. Countless blades of sword chi crisscrossed through the air and sliced through the void, signifying that the sword intent contained by each wisp of sword chi had already reached a legendary and paramount state of purity. Chen Pingan could see that Zuoyu wasn't willing to speak, but he couldn't leave just like that, could he? That would be far too disrespectful. Since Chen Pingan had nothing better to do, he decided to calm his mind and focus his gaze on the movement of the sword chi, hoping to discover some so-called rules and principles. Approximately 7 minutes later, and after having developed sore eyes, Chen Pingan's mind fluctuated slightly before quickly becoming calm again. A wisp of sword chi had been on the verge of being released just then, seemingly about to break free from Zuoyu's control. The sense of fear and trepidation Chen Pingan felt at that instant was as if an immortal were wielding an entire mountain and about to smash it into his mind's lake. Chen Pingan couldn't help but feel anxious. Zuyu's eyes remained closed, but he finally opened his mouth and asked, "Is something the matter? Where is the scholarly sage right now?" Chen Pingan asked, "How should I find him if I have the opportunity to travel to the Middle-earth divine continent in the future?" Zuyu's expression lightened a little as he replied in an indifferent voice, "Master has already left Tassel Mountain and gone to open up a primordial land that many generations of Confucian sages and nobles have failed to open up. A senior from the Middle-earth divine continent is responsible for clearing the path with his sword, while Master is responsible for stabilizing and consolidating the path. Both tasks are equally important." Chen Pingan nodded and said, "Thank you for clearing things up, Senior Zua. How is your scholarly pursuit going?" Zuyu asked. "I haven't slacked off when it comes to reading, and I'm continuing to examine my heart at the same time," Chen Pingan answered. "The results are quite mediocre," Zuyu commented. "Reading is a long-term pursuit, and I'm not talented enough to read quickly and read widely. Doing so will inevitably result in a shallow understanding. Given this, it's better for me to read slowly and read carefully, seeking depth over shallowness," Chen Pingan explained. Zuyu offered no response. Standing on the opposite city wall, Yao Chongdao was feeling slightly jealous as he said in exasperation, "What's so interesting to look at over there? The gulf between their cultivation bases is far too great, so they definitely won't get into a fight." Ning Yao wanted to say something, but she couldn't help but hesitate. Very few people at the Sword Chi Great Wall knew about the relationship between Chen Pingan and Zuyu, and Ning Yao hadn't mentioned a single word about this even to Grandma Bai and Grandpa Nalan. The most interesting thing was that with Zuyu's temperament, he most likely wouldn't have bothered to open his eyes, much less open his mouth to say anything, if he didn't have some kind of relationship with Chen Pingan. With this in mind, Yao Chongdao was actually feeling very confused right now, not understanding why a strange sword cultivator like Zuyu, who cared about nothing but his sword, would oppose the Yao clan and the Ning clan for the sake of an outsider before. Was Zuyu not being too much of a busybody? Thus, if it weren't for the young man with the surname Chen getting involved and acting as a peacemaker, Yao Chongdao would have already been standing on the vast battlefield to the south of the city wall, and been personally judging the height of Zuyu's sword skills. Defeat or victory wouldn't be important. After all, defeat would have been the only possible outcome. Even though Yao Chongdao was a great sword immortal at the immortal tier, he was already very old and had no chance of advancing any further. After battling without reprieve for several hundred years and accumulating more and more issues, even Yao Chongdao had to concede that he was increasingly failing to live up to his name as a great sword immortal. He would feel glad but also a sense of melancholy whenever he saw those young earth immortals and those spirited unpolished jade tier juniors. Only when he looked at his granddaughter, who was the undisputed leader of the young prodigies, would a slight smile appear on the face of the old man, whom all young had nicknamed Bitter Melon Face. One time, someone who had enjoyed one too many drinks said he would discover his conscience whenever he saw old man Yao's bitter melon face, which seemed to be screaming, "Repay your debt." He would immediately recall the wine money that he still owed the old man from many years ago. Afterward, all of the restaurants and wine shops owned by the Yao clan refused to sell this person wine, not even a single pot. He didn't need to repay his debt either. By the looks of it, the two of them are already acquainted? Yao Chongdao asked in a casual manner. There was only one thing Ning Yao could reveal, and she replied, "The intercontinental ship that Chen Pingan was on was obstructed above the Flood Dragon Trench when he traveled to the Sword Chi Great Wall for the first time, and it was Zuyu who unleashed a sword strike to open the path." News of this had spread to the Sword Chi Great Wall, but most of the information was incomplete. Firstly, this was a taboo subject for Stalactite Mountain, given that Zuyu had fought a hearty battle with the Great Heavenly Lord, a direct disciple of the Taoist second disciple, above the sea, following his actions at the Flood Dragon Trench. Moreover, Zuyu seemingly never needed a reason to strike with his sword. In reality, Yao Chongdao and Ning Yao didn't see each other much, and they chatted with each other even less. Thus, the interaction between them wasn't any better than the interaction between Zuyu and Chen Pingan. "For all these years, I've always remembered the life-saving help rendered by you, Senior Zua, in slaying those flood dragons at the Flood Dragon Trench," Chen Pingan said. Getting to the root of the matter, this event had nothing to do with you, Zuiyu replied indifferently. I'm aware that you don't view me as your junior, Chen Pingan said with a smile. There's no need to overthink this. Only a minuscule number of people, matters, and scenery are worthy in my eyes, Zuiyu responded. I've never viewed it as necessary to acknowledge you as my senior brother either, Chen Pingan added. Zuiyu smiled and opened his eyes, gazing into the distance instead of looking at Chen Pingan. Oh! Chen Pingan's expression was calm as he shuffled around and faced the distance, still sitting cross-legged as he explained. I'm not young and naive like before, and I'm instead young and full of vigor. These are just some words from my heart. Zuiyu didn't get angry, and he instead changed the topic completely by saying, living in this world, the most important thing apart from determining the vastness or smallness of the world is to prove the reality and authenticity of oneself. Then I'll say a few more things from the bottom of my heart, Chen Pingan said slowly. Perhaps these things will be completely unreasonable, but it's not possible for me not to say them. Senior Zhua, you have pursued both knowledge and sword skills during your life, with neither affecting the other. In the end, you soared to great heights after accumulating knowledge and power for a long time, with the many ups and downs being absolutely spectacular to witness. First, it was causing countless innate sword talents to bow their heads and yield, and after that was venturing across the seas to visit immortals, using your sword to challenge the northern complete reed continent. In the end, you even used your sword to challenge the parasol leaf continent, slaying Du Mao in a powerful display and stopping him from ascending. After doing so many things, why are you avoiding a trip back to the eastern treasured vile continent to take a look? What Mr. Qi was thinking was his personal matter, but as a senior brother, one should act as a senior brother should. Zuiyu remained silent. Chen Pingan stood up and continued, This is the only thing I wanted to say after arriving at the Sword Qi Great Wall and hearing that you were also here. Chen Pingan was just about to bid farewell and leave when Zuiyu said, Don't place yourself so high when speaking with a senior. Chen Pingan could only swallow his words of farewell and obediently sit back down. Truth be told, he had already mentally prepared himself for a beating before making his way to the city wall. If worst came to worst, he could simply lie in bed at the Ning residence for a month or so. The two of them fell silent. Senior Zhua, you have something to say? Chen Pingan asked. Zuiyu shook his head and replied, I can't be bothered speaking reason. This isn't my strong suit, so I'm hesitating about how powerful my sword strike should be. Your cultivation base is too low, and this actually makes things more troublesome. Chen Pingan didn't think that Zuiyu was joking, so he asked, The scholarly sage likes to drink wine and also likes to travel around the world, but he hasn't visited the Sword Qi Great Wall before? The wine here is actually quite decent. Zuiyu seemed a little aggrieved in an uncharacteristic display, and he exclaimed, Piss off. Chen Pingan heeded his senior's instructions, immediately standing up and calling out to Ning Yao. He then summoned a talismanic boat and had it hover beyond the parapet. Yao Chongdao nodded at Ning Yao, following which Ning Yao flew through the air and landed on the talismanic boat, returning to the city that was still brightly lit at night with Chen Pingan, who was purposely acting calm and composed. Zuiyu glanced at the young man in azure on the talismanic boat, especially that extremely familiar white jade hairpin. He then closed his eyes and continued to temper his sword intent. When it came to snitching on others to their master, one of the disciples had been extremely skilled, always having evidence and reason on his side. All of them had been young back then, and which of them had been most skilled at this? Yao Chongdao arrived near Zuiyu, gazing at the distant talismanic boat and city as he asked, Zuiyu, you hold this young man in very high regard? I have a very ordinary impression of the Yao clan, so don't try to rely on your old age to speak nonsense to me, Zuiyu said in a calm and apathetic voice. Yao Chongdao was on the verge of exploding in anger. Was Zuiyu truly taking him for a mild-tempered clay bodhisattva? He would fight if that was what Zuiyu wanted. Who was afraid of whom? Could Zuiyu truly beat him to death? Just then, the old great sword immortal smiled and walked out of his thatched cottage, standing at the door and gazing up as he remarked in a soft voice, What a rare guest. Chen Qingdu quickly returned to his thatched cottage. There was no need for him to worry, seeing that the visitor was a guest and not an enemy. Chen Qingdu simply stomped his foot, immediately summoning a restriction and forming a small barrier along the parapet of the Sword Qi Great Wall, lest the commotion here attract any unnecessary and prying gazes. Apart from Chan Qingdu being the first to notice some traces, several sages and the Lord Hidden Official also detected that something was amiss. No one was able to silently and directly pass through the restrictions in the skies of the two large worlds and arrive at the Sword Qi Great Wall without passing through the gates of Stalactite Mountain first. The Taoist Great Heavenly Lord, who was responsible for guarding Stalactite Mountain, was unable to do this. Perhaps even the accompanying sages in the Confucian temples who held jade tablets and were responsible for overseeing the continents of the majestic world would be unable to do this. Many sword immortals guarding the city wall were yet to realize that an uninvited guest had already snuck onto the city wall. Those outside the Sword Qi Great Wall were even more oblivious. Wanting to investigate the situation after the unexpected barrier appeared around the parapet would be as difficult as trying to ascend to the heavens. In any case, no one dared to move rashly, so many of the sword immortals continued to concentrate on their cultivation. Zuiyu faltered for a moment and was just about to stand up. However, someone slapped him on the back of the head and exclaimed, "Is this how you speak to your elders? Where are your manners?" Zuiyu hesitated for a moment before ultimately deciding to stand up. His master had arrived, so it was only right that he should get up and pay his respects. However, he was struck by another smack to the back of his head, and his master exclaimed, "You don't want to listen, huh? You want to talk back, huh? You really can't go 3 days without a beating, huh?" Zuiyu could only stop in an awkward posture halfway between sitting and standing, following which he said to Yao Chongdao, "This junior was in the wrong, so please accept my apology, Senior Yao." Afterward, Yao Chongdao saw an old man, who looked like an impoverished Confucian scholar, reaching over with his hand and helping the slightly uneasy Zuiyu up. At the same time, he cracked a dazzling smile at Yao Chongdao and said, "Your clan leader Yao, Great Sword Immortal Yao, correct? It's my pleasure to meet you. You gave birth to a great daughter, and you helped her find a great son-in-law. They then gave birth to an incredible granddaughter, and this granddaughter found herself the best grandson-in-law. You truly enjoy an amazing fortune, Great Sword Immortal Yao. I can't help but feel very envious of you. However, those disciples of yours are quite ordinary." Zuiyu was finally able to stand up and speak, and he took one step back before bowing and saying in greeting, "Master." The terrifying blades of Sword Qi surrounding Zuiyu had no effect on the old scholar in azure, whose figure was wavering and insubstantial. There was a look of disbelief on Yao Chongdao's face as he asked in uncertainty, "Scholarly sage?" The old scholar appeared embarrassed as he replied, "Enough with the title of scholarly sage or whatnot. This title was stripped a long time ago. I'm still young, so I don't deserve to be addressed as such by you, clan leader Yao. It's only because of some good fortune that I was able to enjoy this measly honor in the past. There's no point mentioning it anymore. In any case, I'm younger than you, clan leader Yao, so feel free to refer to me as little brother." Yao Chongdao was slightly dazed and dumbfounded. He was a little unsure of how to interact with this extremely renowned scholarly sage. The complex formalities and pedantic adherence to etiquette of the Confucian sect was coincidentally what the Sword Qi Great Wall scoffed at the most. The old scholar looked around and said in a frantic voice, "I came in a hurry, and I also need to leave soon. I can't stay here for too long. Where is that old great sword immortal? Why don't we have a quick chat?" Sitting inside the thatched cottage, Chen Qingdu smiled and said with a nod, "All right, then let's have a quick chat." A Confucian sage who was responsible for overseeing the Sword Qi Great Wall actively made his way over and greeted with a bow, "My respects to scholarly sage." The sages from the 3 teachings would take turns to oversee the Sword Qi Great Wall, though there was no explicit rule regarding how long each cycle would last. This Confucian sage had once been a talented Buddhist disciple who had been renowned throughout a great world, and after arriving at the Sword Qi Great Wall, he was now profoundly knowledgeable in both Buddhism and Confucianism, achieving mastery in the mystical abilities of both teachings. Even the Lord Hidden Official was quite unwilling to provoke or offend him. The old scholar remarked with emotion, "You only lost the debate because your knowledge wasn't deep and intricate enough, not because the teachings of Buddhism are inferior. I encouraged you not to act like this back then. Was it really necessary to join the Confucian sect? And what now?" You're suffering the consequences as well, aren't you? Do you really think that one person can fully digest the fundamental knowledge of two teachings? If such a beneficial act is truly that easy, then what's the point of arguing with each other? If that were the case, then perhaps the Tao ancestor and Buddha aren't skilled enough at stopping arguments? In any case, you're only lacking in debates, whereas you're still very good at fighting. Such a shame. Such a great shame. If these words landed in the ears of Confucian disciples from the scholarly temples and the Confucian schools, then they would very much be regarded as traitorous and in opposition to Tao. At the very least, they would be regarded as siding with another teaching. The Confucian sage, who had defected to the Confucian sect after losing a debate, smiled faintly and replied, "To transcend time is to discover freedom." This simple remark surprisingly caused heaven and earth to instantly change color at the Sword Qi Great Wall. However, a burst of sword qi from the city wall quickly pushed back this phenomenon. The old scholar sighed and swayed his head back and forth, disappearing in a flash and arriving at the thatched cottage. Chen Qingdu gestured with his hand and said with a smile, "Please have a seat, scholarly sage." The old scholar put on a serious expression as he stated, "The scholarly temple needs to borrow 3 people from you." "Why did you come?" Chen Qingdu asked. "Why wasn't it someone more appropriate like the etiquette sage or the second sage? Or the assistant sect master of the Middle Earth Divine Continent's scholarly temple?" The scholarly sage chuckled and replied, "Because I'm shameless enough, of course. They would definitely be left dejected and depressed if they came." "No can do," Chen Qingdu said with a shake of his head. "That's not very good," the old scholar mumbled. So you arrived outside the thatched cottage. After a short time, the old scholar walked out of the thatched cottage with a melancholy expression, sighing, "What a tough negotiator. However, I have to negotiate with him no matter how difficult it is." "When are you leaving, master?" Zuyu asked. The scholarly sage scratched his head and replied, "I have to try again, don't I? However, there's nothing I can do if the negotiations fall through. And I'll still have to leave when I have to leave. There's no way around this. I'm destined to be busy and to carry all the blame." "You're not going to visit Chen Pingan?" Zuyu asked. "Are you telling me what to do?" The old scholar fumed. Zuyu fell silent and didn't say anything else. As expected of the founder of the scholarly lineage. As if feeling slightly guilty, the old scholar patted Zuyu's shoulder and said, "Zuyu, the scholar whom you and I respected has finally forged a path, one as vast as a 5th world. Everything is abundant there, with the exception of people. The population won't increase significantly in the short term either. Is this not perfectly suitable for your needs? Are you not going to head over to take a look?" Zuyu shook his head and replied, "Master, there aren't many people here either, and it's also better than that completely new world. This is because the more time that passes, the fewer people who will remain here. They won't come rushing over to increase the population. Oh, it's been so upsetting for me as a master. None of my disciples is willing to listen to me," the old scholar lamented. "There's still Chen Pingan, isn't there?" Zuyu responded in a soft voice. "Zuyu, you're going to take things too far if you keep stabbing my heart like this," the old scholar said in a meaningful and heartfelt voice. "Why isn't it appropriate for you to visit Chen Pingan, master?" Zuyu asked in confusion. The old scholar smiled and frowned at the same time, causing his expression to appear strange as he replied, "I heard that your junior brother recently established an ancestral hall on a mountain in his hometown, placing a portrait of me inside at the highest and most central location. This is actually quite inappropriate, and secretly placing my portrait in his study would have been enough. I'm not the type of person to get pedantic about these small matters after all. Did I care when I was kicked out of the scholarly temple back then? I didn't care at all. The shallow notions of fame and fortune are vast and pointless, just like the salted peanuts that are eaten one after another when enjoying wine." "Master, please wipe the smile from your face first," Zuyu said in a reminder. The old scholar nodded in response. When he discovered that old man Yao was no longer standing on the city wall, he rubbed his face before jumping up and smacking Zuyu on the head, scolding, "And you still have the gall to complain about other people speaking nonsense? Aren't you full of nonsense as well? You're the dimmest out of all my disciples." He's an elder from Ning Yao's family, after all, so this disciple inevitably had his hands tied. Zuyu replied in helplessness. I didn't say it was wrong for you to have your hands tied and not move, but with the large number of sword qi around you, would it be strange for you to lose control of a wisp or two even if you remained unmoving? The old scholar commented in confusion. These wisps of sword qi could have swept toward old man Yao, and after a few shouts of anger from him, the two of you could have naturally engaged in a sparring session that provided mutual benefit to your sword Dao. And after defeating old man Yao, you could have loudly flattered him to bring the conflict to a nice close. Did this never cross your mind? This disciple is dull-witted, and your suggestion is very reasonable, master. Zuiyu replied with a nod. The old scholar turned around and ran back to the thatched cottage, saying, I just thought of a few things, so I'm going to haggle with him again. Zuiyu walked over to the parapet. A short moment later, the old scholar sighed deeply and returned to Zuiyu's side. Master, is it already the limit of cultivators to stand on one speck of dust and walk onto another speck of dust? Zuiyu asked. The old scholar smiled and replied, One tree will greet another tree in the wind, one mountain will remain silent to another mountain for hundreds upon thousands of years, and one river will crash into another river after growing wide and mature. All matter will quietly observe this and feel content. Zuiyu mulled over this for a moment before saying, Please explain this in simpler terms, master. I didn't know the answer to your question, so I could only give you a perfunctory answer, the old scholar replied. Zuiyu was rendered speechless. Immortal forces sit atop the mountains, while mortal paths fill themselves with mud and water, the old scholar said with emotion. Master, you are criticizing this disciple, Zuiyu said. The old scholar shook his head and responded in a solemn voice. I'm asking more of noble people and prodigies. Afterward, no further words were exchanged as Zuiyu accompanied his master, and enjoyed the scenery for an entire night. When morning arrived, the scholarly sage turned around and walked toward the thatched cottage, saying, I'll roll around and shout if I'm not able to persuade Chen Qingdu this time. Zuiyu silently waited for the outcome. The old scholar walked out from the thatched cottage at noon, twisting his beard in silence. Chen Pingan is going to propose marriage to the Ning clan, and the old great sword immortal has agreed to be their matchmaker, Zuiyu revealed in a low voice. The old scholar was taken aback, and he immediately thumped his chest and stomped his foot, exclaiming, Chen Qingdu, that old geezer. How shameless. What has this got to do with him? Is he treating me like I'm dead? All right, even if I am half dead. There was a loud pop. The old scholar's already shaky body transformed into a shadow before vanishing for good, almost as if he had suddenly disappeared from this world. Zuiyu narrowed his eyes and grabbed the hilt of his sword as he turned around to face the thatched cottage. However, there was a small ripple the next instant, with the old scholar appearing travel-worn and exhausted as he reappeared and stood still again. He reached over and patted Zuiyu's sword-wielding arm. Even so, Zuiyu still didn't let go of his sword hilt. The old scholar smiled and said, It's okay. It's not a big deal. Chen Qingdu appeared at the entrance of the thatched cottage and asked with a smile, Are you planning to stay here and nag me? The old scholar sighed and replied, I can't stay here for long, even if I want to. I'll immediately pack up and piss off after having some wine to drink. This was the suppressive power of heaven and earth. It hadn't been easy for Lu Chen to travel from the heavenly world to the majestic world, and then to the jewel small world back then either, having to face suppression from the great Tao wherever he went. Chen Qingdu smiled and said in reminder, There's no bet for the scholarly sage over here. I suggest that you don't take what isn't yours. Oh, that's right. That works too, the old scholar said in realization. Die. The Sword Qi Great Wall was actually very peaceful when it wasn't engaged in war, with the prosperous streets bustling with people and the small alleys filled with noise. However, there wasn't a scholarly temple or a martial sage temple here, nor were there traditions of putting up door gods, writing spring couplets, or going to the graves to honor their ancestors. The completely obliterated street was currently being repaired, with workers bustling around as they carried out their tasks. Meanwhile, the main culprit was sitting on a stool outside a miscellaneous shop and basking in the sun. There were few customers and business was ordinary, so Ning Yao was chatting casually with Dai Zhang. Seeing that Dai Zhang didn't appear anxious at all, Chen Pingan couldn't help but feel slightly anxious himself. However, they had only met each other a few times, so it wasn't Chen Pingan's place to say anything. He needed to pay special attention when it came to women besides the person whom he loved. A little child quietly snuck over, wiping his nose with a fist as he mustered his courage and asked, "You're called Chen Pingan, correct?" Chen Pingan smiled and asked, "What's the matter? Do you want to challenge me to a fight?" The little child retreated several steps in fright, but he was still unwilling to leave as he asked, "Are you able to teach me fist techniques? I can give you money." "No," Chen Pingan replied with a shake of his head. "If you're worried about the payment being too little, I can be indebted to you first and slowly pay you back when I master the fist technique and kill demons to earn money. In any case, you're very capable, and your fist is powerful, so I wouldn't dare to owe you money and not repay it." Chen Pingan placed his hands inside his opposite sleeves, with his shoulders relaxed and loose as he asked in a lazy voice, "Why do you want to learn fist techniques? I'm not an innate sword talent, and I'm not very capable when it comes to practicing the sword. No one is willing to teach me either, and even big sister Dai Zhang grumbles about my poor aptitude. She insists that I become a bricklayer instead. I looked after her shop for several months for nothing," the little child replied in frustration. Chen Pingan smiled and explained, "Learning fist techniques is similar to learning sword techniques, and both cost a huge sum of money and have certain requirements for aptitude. It's better that you become a bricklayer." The little child squatted down, perhaps having already predicted this outcome beforehand. He observed the young man in azure who claimed to be from Majestic World, thinking that he couldn't be blamed for being impolite, seeing that the young man had spoken so rudely. Thus he said, "Your looks are quite ordinary, so why is Big Sister Ning attracted to you?" Chen Pingan was slightly amused as he asked, "Are people only attracted to looks? What else?" the little child retorted. Chen Pingan smiled and said, "I'm not ugly either." The child squatted there and shook his head with a sigh. Chen Pingan felt slightly hurt. His looks were indeed a bit inferior to Chen Sancho and Pang Yuanji, but he wasn't anywhere near close to being ugly, was he? He raised his hand and rubbed the stubble on his chin. It was most likely because he wasn't cleanly shaved. With this daring child leading the charge, it wasn't long before a large group of noisy children gathered around them. There were also some young boys and young girls slightly further away. Their eyes were filled with curiosity as they looked at the outsider who had fought 4 battles in a row. When Majestic World was enjoying a lush spring with swaying willows, the Sword Chi Great Wall would be experiencing the biting wind of autumn. There was only a single gate separating the two completely different worlds, and the opposite seasons in the two naturally resulted in vastly different customs. It wasn't difficult to survive at the Sword Chi Great Wall, and even the most frail child could survive at this place. However, it was incredibly difficult to live a good life here. Thus, those who were able to enjoy wine often, even if they owed wine money, were definitely no ordinary people. Of course, it was a different story for descendants of large clans. They didn't need to worry about food and shelter, and it was very easy for them to enjoy the lifestyles of kings and nobility. This was genuinely a case of their ancestors accumulating virtue, with those sword immortals and sword cultivators sacrificing their lives to win the privilege for their descendants. In any case, these descendants needed to enter the battlefield and fight as well, so being able to return alive from the Great Wall was enough reason for them to enjoy life. Perhaps because Chen Pingan seemed easygoing, it didn't take long for a large group of children to surround his small stool and loudly chatter away. Outsiders who were able to enter the Sword Chi Great Wall from Stalactite Mountain would often stay in the area where all the large families and large clans were gathered. They didn't like to visit this area. Chen Pingan had discussed many local people and matters with Ning Yao during his first trip to the Sword Chi Great Wall, allowing him to understand the spectrum of attitudes that the indigenous youths held toward Majestic World, a world that was so close yet so different. Some people announced they would definitely visit Majestic World to enjoy a bowl of the most authentic Yangchan noodles, while others had heard there were many beautiful women there. These women were truly just mortal women, so frail and slender that they would sway around and not possess a single wisp of sword chi. They also wanted to know what kind of godly lifestyle the scholars in the Majestic World enjoyed. Chen Pingan was being peppered with questions right now, and he chose to answer some of them while also choosing to purposely ignore some of them. A child who had yet to venture south of the city wall asked whether there were truly countless undulating green mountains in Majestic World. Ones that were incredibly lush and where people could take a deep breath and smell the fragrance of plants and flowers after the rain. A slightly older boy asked Chen Pingan what it was like when mountain gods and water gods married or wed their children, what it was like when the city gods heard cases and issued judgments at night, and what mountain spirits and water ghosts looked like. Someone hurriedly retrieved a wrinkled but treasured children's book and asked whether the descriptions and illustrations in the book were accurate. When there were mandarin ducks hiding under the lotus leaves to shelter from the rain, did the people from the large houses truly need to hang nets from their eaves to prevent the birds from building nests and shitting everywhere? Would people truly not feel cold under the skywells when it rained or snowed during the middle of winter? And was the wine over there truly like stones on the roadside, free and available for everyone to drink? Was it actually unreasonable that they needed to pay for wine here? Also, what kind of places were those brothels with silvery laughs? What kind of wine was flower wine? What was plowing the fields and sowing seeds all about? Why did people over there still need a place to live even after they died? Were they not afraid of running out of space for living people to live? Was the majestic world truly so big? In the end, a young boy grumbled, "You don't know much, huh? You're only answering 1 out of every 3 questions, and you call yourself someone from majestic world." Chen Pingan quietly flicked his wrist and retrieved his sword-nurturing gourd, taking a swig of wine before waving his hand and saying, "Run along now. Don't delay your big sister Daizhong from doing business." The little child who had arrived first to speak with Chen Pingan squatted beside the small stool and said, "There's no business at the shop anyway, so why don't we chat for a bit longer? Speaking nonsense with you and the others for so long hasn't earned me a single copper coin either," Chen Pingan replied with a chuckle. The children moaned and complained as they turned around and left. Only after running very far away did the little child look back and shout, "Big Sister Ning, this person is so miserly and stingy, so why are you attracted to him?" Chen Pingan acted as if he were going to stand up, causing the little child to sprint and turn into an alley. However, he poked his head out and shouted in a louder voice, "I'm not lying to you, Big Sister Yao, but Chen Pingan secretly told me just then that Big Sister Daizhong is quite good-looking as well. You definitely can't fall for this kind of womanizer." Standing inside the shop and leaning against the counter, Ning Yao exchanged a smile with Daizhong. Chen Pingan returned to his small stool and raised his middle finger toward the alley in the distance. Following the commotion, he peacefully drank some wine under the warm sun. He was still slightly unaccustomed to this. He suddenly stood up at this moment. As it turned out, an old scholar had appeared beside him at some unknown time. The old scholar patted the young man's shoulder and said, "You've grown up. You must have gone through a lot." Daizhong glanced outside the shop and felt slightly puzzled. There were very few scholars at the Sword Qi Great Wall, especially since there were no private schools and no teachers. For example, those born into impoverished households like Daizhong could only rely on those crooked stone tablets of varying sizes that were casually placed around the streets and alleys to learn how to read and write. They would learn a few characters a day, and after a long time, they would eventually be able to read books if they were truly studious enough in their studies. However, their education wouldn't extend much further than this. Even though Ning Yao hadn't met the scholarly sage before, she was still able to roughly guess the old man's identity. She didn't feel much about this, and her only thought at this moment was that during her travels through the majestic world, when some books were yet to be banned, the portraits of the scholarly sage in those books truly weren't accurate at all. Those portraits were very similar, and regardless of whether they were half portraits or full portraits, they all depicted the scholarly sage as a dignified and magnificent person. By the looks of it, however, he was actually just a skinny old man. Daizhong was slightly confused, but Ning Yao said, "We'll chat by ourselves. There's no need to mind them." There was an unexpected reunion outside. There was a smile on Chen Pingan's face, but he didn't say anything else. The old scholar turned around and looked at the 2 young women inside the shop, asking in a quiet voice, "Which one is it?" "The better-looking one," Chen Pingan replied quietly. The old scholar was extremely pleased, and he held his hand over his chest and raised his thumb. Chen Pingan asked the old scholar to wait for a moment first, heading inside the shop and giving Daizhong a heads up as he carried a chair outside. Hearing Daizhong say that there were no snacks in the shop, Chen Pingan asked Ning Yao whether she could help buy some snacks from outside. Ning Yao nodded and quickly visited a nearby wine shop, returning a short while later with some snacks and even some cups and bowls. Chen Pingan and the scholarly sage were sitting on their stools already, and it appeared quite comical as they used the chair as a wine table. Chen Pingan stood up, wanting to accept the box of snacks and open it himself. However, Ningyao shot a glare at him and put a plate down, also setting down the wine bowls as well as the box of snacks. She then turned to the old scholar and told him to enjoy the food and wine. The old scholar had already stood up alongside Chen Pingan, with the smile on his face growing even wider at this moment. He was over the moon. Ningyao called Daizhong over, leaving the shop together to go for a stroll. The old scholar smacked his lips and took a large swig of wine, shuddering and taking a deep breath as he remarked, "After exhausting myself so much, I can finally relax and enjoy myself for a bit now." Chen Pingan drank slowly as he smiled and looked at the old scholar who seemingly hadn't changed at all. The old scholar grabbed some snacks with his chopsticks, and upon seeing no movement from Chen Pingan, he raised his chopsticks and said in a muffled voice, "Get yourself some food. Just learning to drink isn't good enough, and drinking without eating is boring and stifling. I was poor back then, so I could only treat the sagely scriptures as snacks to go with my wine." Chui Chan, that little bastard, was stubborn and blockhead to begin with, and he mistakenly thought that reading while drinking was some kind of refined and elegant behavior, even going as far as to emulate this afterward. Little did he know that if I had money at the time, the table would already be filled with snacks to accompany my wine. Gone would be those bloody scholarly scriptures. Only those who scolded themselves the hardest could come up with the most reasonable criticisms. Chen Pingan grabbed some food with his chopsticks and chewed slowly, following which he took a small sip of wine, appearing as adept as could be. He wasn't speechless, but rather, he had absolutely no clue where to begin. He didn't know what could be said and what couldn't be said. The chopsticks of the old scholar became a blur as he continued to eat and drink. Thankfully, Ningyao had purchased more than enough snacks. Chen Pingan would lean over and pour wine whenever the old scholar's wine bowl became empty. After eating and drinking, Chen Pingan placed the wine bowls and snack plates back inside the food box. Meanwhile, the old scholar used his sleeves to wipe away the splattered wine and sauce on the chair. It was at this moment that Zuyu instantly arrived at the entrance of the shop. "What brings you here?" the old scholar asked. "This disciple wants to see more of you, master," Zuyu replied. The old scholar pointed at the vacant chair and chuckled in anger. "Your sword skills are the highest, so why don't you sit here?" Zuyu glanced at Chen Pingan, who had no option but to give up his small stool. Chen Pingan walked around the chair and stood beside the old scholar. This being the case, the old scholar had no option but to sit on the chair so that Chen Pingan could sit on his stool. "Have the two of you acknowledged each other as junior brother and senior brother yet?" the old scholar asked. "It doesn't feel like it," Zuyu replied. "I feel the same way," Chen Pingan concurred. Now sitting on the chair, the old scholar naturally favored his closing disciple more, so he immediately smacked Zuyu's head and scolded, "Just what kind of senior brother are you? You simply became my disciple earlier, so what are you feeling so arrogant about? How many years have you been single for?" Disregarding everything else and just focusing on this important matter, the entire scholarly lineage is being held up by your junior brother now, carrying your sword and running around here and there. Can your sword warm your bed? Or can it help you make tea? Senior Zhuo was planning to teach me sword techniques on the parapet before. However, he was feeling slightly worried because my cultivation base is too low, Chen Pingan said. This naturally earns Zuyu another smack on the back of the head. Zuyu's expression was dark, and he thought to himself that he definitely wouldn't feel worried at all after their master left the Sword Chi Great Wall. Of course, seniors will also stood up for me when I first met Mr. Yao, Chen Pingan added. The old scholar nodded and turned around, saying in a nonchalant manner, "I was wrong to hit you just then. Why didn't you explain things clearly, Zuyu? You've been like this since you were little, and you need to change this habit. You won't hold a grudge against me for hitting you wrongly, will you? Remember to speak out if you feel aggrieved. Being able to resolutely correct one's mistakes is a great virtue." It was relying on this saying that I was able to forcefully produce a great number of profound principles back then, baffling even those talented Buddhist disciples. No, Master was naturally always correct. Thus, Zuyu remained silent the entire time. However, he decided to give that little brat 2 sword technique training sessions. One session definitely wouldn't be enough. Mountain Cliff Academy's assistant mountain master has really missed you. Master, Chen Pingan suddenly said. This was Chen Pingan's first time referring to the scholarly sage as simply his master. The old scholar burped and pricked up his ears, purposely acting puzzled as he asked, "Who? What? Can you repeat that again?" Zuyu rolled his eyes. "Senior brother Mao really misses you, master," Chen Pingan repeated with a smile. The old scholar turned around and leaned on the armrest, looking at Chen Pingan as he chuckled. Little Dong is incredibly patient and is the most willing to use the simplest and dumbest methods to teach people, just like me. However, he's similar to Zuyu in the sense that he's unbelievably stubborn at times and can't show any flexibility at all. Back then, I was on the verge of tying Mao Xiaodong up and stuffing him into a sack before tossing him into the School of Rites. I already abandoned my face and privately forged some relationships for him, but he refused to go to the School of Rites no matter what. I was left powerless as his master. Why were you unwilling to acknowledge master as your master back then, but you're doing so now that your cultivation base is higher? Zuyu suddenly asked. I was yet to read and study back then, so what right did I have to acknowledge the scholarly sage as my master? Simple, because master is the scholarly sage. Chen Pingan replied. If that's the case, then what if the paramount sage, the etiquette sage, or the second sage appeared before me and were willing to take me as their disciple? Should I accept their offer as well? A master being willing to take a disciple is one thing, but a disciple should also assess their master before accepting. Reading the books and scriptures of the 3 teachings and 100 schools of thought is like comparing the products of various different vendors, and I concluded that master's knowledge is indeed the best. It's because of this that I've acknowledged the scholarly sage as my master. Even if master regrets this decision and goes back on it in the future, I'll still continue to study and learn from him. Only by doing this can I display an upright mind and sincere intentions. Zuyu faltered for a long time. He had seen shameless people before, but he had never seen such a shameless person. Did this brat, Chen Pingan, run a business selling principles and reason? 3 training sessions. The old scholar kicked Zuyu and scolded. Why are you sitting there like a statue? Bring some wine over. Master, I don't like drinking wine, and in any case, Chen Pingan has a whole heap of wine on him. Zuyu replied in frustration. You're single, Zuyu, so it doesn't matter if you owe money or whatnot, the old scholar said in a meaningful and heartfelt manner. He continued to persuade his disciple with reason. However, things are different for your junior brother. He has his own mountains, and he's also about to get married soon. Just how much spending does this entail? You were the one helping me look after money in the past, so are you not aware of how difficult it is to maintain a home and raise a family? You should act like a senior brother and avoid attracting ridicule and contempt to the scholarly lineage. So be it if you don't treat your master to wine. Go to the city wall and shout that you're Chen Pingan's senior brother, lest your junior brother be picked on when I'm not around in the future. Zuyu played deaf and mute. When they traveled around the world in the past to seek knowledge, this would represent Zuyu's greatest protest against his master. Chen Pingan retrieved 2 pots of wine from his minimization treasure and handed both to the old scholar. Both pots were rice wine from the Dragon Spring Prefecture. Seeing that he had given all of his immortal wine to the sword-hugging middle-aged man guarding the gates of Stalactite Mountain, the old scholar handed 1 pot to Zuyu. Zuyu didn't turn it down. Chen Pingan grabbed a pot for himself. The old scholar smiled with squinted eyes and asked, How does it taste, Zuyu? Zuyu could only do his best to maintain his conscience as he replied, It's okay. The old scholar shook his head and clicked his tongue, saying, Only someone who doesn't understand how to drink wine will say something like this. He then turned around to look at Chen Pingan. Sure enough, he didn't disappoint the old scholar. Chen Pingan smiled and said, Free wine is always the most delicious. The scholarly sage laughed heartily in response. After waiting for a long time, he discovered that Chen Pingan was looking right at him. The old scholar cleared his throat and said, Rest assured, you can ask your senior brother to treat you to wine in the future. As long as you're drinking at the Sword Chi Great Wall, whether it's by yourself or with friends, remember to put the tab on Zuyu's name. Zuyu. I understand, Zuyu said with a sigh. However, the old scholar called Zuyu's name again. Zuyu was already 1 step ahead and he added, I don't feel aggrieved at all. Only after hearing this did the old scholar feel satisfied. Chen Pingan continued to drink wine, thinking that the more this was the case, the more difficult his life would be in the near future. However, the old scholar was very understanding and he said, "Your senior brother's Wuyu sword skills are quite okay, but there's no need for you to learn them if you don't want to. If you want to learn them, then just tell your senior brother how exactly you want to learn them. Your senior brother won't take things too far." "We can start the lessons now," Zuyu said. "There's no hurry," Chen Pingan immediately said. Zuyu leaned forward and fixed his gaze on Chen Pingan. Chen Pingan looked toward the old scholar. The old scholar understood Chen Pingan's intention and immediately placed a hand on Zuyu's head, pushing it back and scolding, "Go easier on your junior brother." Zuyu started to drink large swigs of wine. This was very strange. The scholarly sage seemingly treated Zuyu the worst out of all his direct disciples, but this disciple was always the one who stuck by his master the most. Even an unofficial disciple like Mao Xiaodong was completely unable to understand this, no matter how hard he racked his brains. However, senior brother Zuyu's disposition was far too cold and reclusive, so Mao Xiaodong, Ma Zhan, and the others didn't really dare to approach Zuyu to speak to him. Cui Chan was yet to betray his master at that time, and he was still the brilliant first disciple of the scholarly sage, shadowing all of the noble scholars and virtuous scholars in the Confucian schools and academies of the Middle Earth divine continent. His knowledge was lofty, his cultivation base was high, and his go skills were even more top-notch. Even so, he was often scolded by Zuyu and was unable to speak back. Whether this was because Cui Chan was unwilling to or didn't dare to, Mao Xiaodong and the others no longer had an opportunity to receive an answer to this question. As for the level of Zuyu's knowledge, the direct disciples of the scholarly sage were enough to explain everything. However, it was a shame that his knowledge was overshadowed by his sword skills. Thus, whenever people in the world mentioned sword immortals Zuyu, a late bloomer, they would only say that his sword skills were lofty, profound, or at the pinnacle of the world. In fact, many people would forget his status as the scholarly sage's disciple. One person suppressing all of the innate sword talents in the world, this was Zuyu. In the eyes of the old scholar, however, the Zuyu who was sitting on the small stool in front of the shop today was still that tall young boy who had a limpid look in his eyes when knocking on the door and saying that he had no money, but that he wanted to read sagely scriptures and learn some principles. If he owed money, he would return it to his master in the future. However, if he studied and became a champion scholar or whatnot, helping his master recruit more disciples, then he wouldn't return this debt in the future. The young boy had been very earnest when saying this at the time. The impoverished scholar hadn't been very old at that time, not having become an old scholar and much less the scholarly sage. He simply had some spare money after releasing a book, meaning that he wasn't so poor that he couldn't even afford wine. This being the case, he had agreed to the young Zuyu's request, thinking that it wasn't right for Cui Chan not to have a junior brother. In any case, the impoverished scholar had thought at the time that his biggest desire was to have successful disciples all over the world. As such, it was good to start with the first disciple and then the second disciple. One couldn't walk 1,000 miles without accumulating small steps, after all, and this was an outstanding saying that he had come up with himself. At that time, the impoverished scholar was only a talented scholar who had passed the county-level imperial exam, and he truly hadn't thought about too much or thought too far into the future. In fact, he had even thought that recruiting many disciples and having them spread throughout the world was nothing more than a distant and unachievable dream. This was similar to daydreaming about pots upon pots of beautiful wine from those large restaurants when drinking a small amount of low-quality wine in an impoverished alley. Many years later, he still had vague recollections of the restaurant owner's young daughter being incredibly beautiful. Looking at her from a distance was like drinking fine wine. One couldn't look too much lest they become drunk. Thus, the old scholar was extremely angry about future generations of Confucian sages framing him as a proper and pedantic person when interpreting one of his works, changing the original meaning of his text far too much. However, it was completely normal and justified for people to have romantic feelings, especially since people were emotional creatures, unlike plants and trees. In any case, even plants and trees could transform into spirits and show human emotions. At the same time, humans weren't sages, so how could they be free from mistakes? Indeed, even sages would make mistakes, so it would be most inappropriate to pedantically hold mortal humans to the standards of sages. If this were the ask, and if this philosophy became the dominant stream, then scholars wouldn't be dragged closer to the level of sages, but rather they would be pushed further and further away. And thus, the old scholar had run to the scholarly temple to speak reason with them, yet the latter had also been very firm, listening to whatever the old scholar said and refusing to argue with him no matter what. In fact, the sage had refused to say a single word. However, it was also this same sage, who could have potentially been accused of being cold and difficult, who had sacrificed his cultivation base as the price for forcefully keeping open that barrier for the majestic world. Only when the old scholar and the sword-wielding scholar appeared before him, had he finally put down the heavy burden and silently passed away, smiling at the old scholar and departing from the world. His soul had dispersed completely, with no hope of entering reincarnation. Life was only fleeting. They had exchanged a smile of mutual understanding and emotional harmony. The old scholar was in no hurry to stand up from his chair after finishing the pot of wine, and he instead held the empty pot in his hands as he basked in the sun of another world. "Master, you should leave now," Suiyu said in a quiet voice. "Otherwise, the ascension tier great demons of this world might step forward together to prevent Master from leaving." Chen Pingan was just about to stand up to say something. The old scholar raised a hand and lightly pushed down, saying, "There's no need to say anything. Master already knows. Master has many things to say, but now is not the right time." He leaned back against the chair, appearing relaxed and comfortable as he murmured, "I'll sit here for a little longer. It's already been many years since I've had two disciples sitting next to me at the same time. There was a disciple to the left and a disciple to the right, with the master sitting in the middle. Suiyu finally wasn't the only disciple accompanying the old scholar. When Ningyao and Daizhong returned to the shop, Daizhong suddenly stopped in her tracks, not daring to take another step forward. This was because she felt respect and fear toward the man who had suddenly appeared at the entrance of her shop. He was none other than great sword immortals Wu, someone who was renowned for his coldness. Regardless of how poor one's temper was in their hometown, ordinary sword cultivators from other continents all needed to rein in their tempers when they arrived at the Sword Chi Great Wall. However, Senior Wu was different. An indigenous immortal tier sword immortal guarding the city wall had attempted to challenge Wu, who was widely recognized as possessing the greatest sword skills in the world, when he had just arrived at the Sword Chi Great Wall. Yet Suiyu had simply said, "You're not able to learn my sword skills, but there is one thing you can learn from me. It's better to avoid a fight that you can't win." The Lord Hidden official had been standing nearby at the time, and she had concurred. "That seems to make sense." And thus, the highly anticipated sparring session hadn't taken place atop the city wall. Daizhong was filled with curiosity following her shock. Why was Wu suppressing his sword chi so much? Everyone at the Sword Chi Great Wall knew that Sword Immortals Wu was always surrounded by sword chi, using this to forge a path forward during the big battles and venturing deep into the ranks of the demon tribe's large army. He would also be surrounded by sword chi when he tempered his sword intent alone atop the parapet. Today, however, the most skillful sword immortal in the majestic world was surprisingly suppressing his sword chi, not displaying a single wisp. Seeing this, Ningyao dragged Daizhong off to stroll around again. Only when Ningyao learned that the scholarly sage had already left did she return to the shop. Unexpectedly, Suiyu was still yet to leave. Before leaving, the old scholar had especially reached out to bid farewell and thank her. Ningyao was slightly puzzled at this moment, not knowing why she deserved the scholarly sage's thanks. Regarding the interesting relationship between Chen Pingan and Suiyu, it wasn't difficult for Ningyao to understand the thoughts of the two people. Thus, she hadn't made any comments about Suiyu to Chen Pingan. It wouldn't be appropriate for her to say anything, and in any case, Chen Pingan had his own views and beliefs regarding these important matters in life. There was no need for Ningyao to interfere, and there wasn't even a need for her to provide suggestions and strategies. Daizhong truly couldn't contain her curiosity, so after walking far away, she used her mind's lake to ask Ningyao, "Is Chen Pingan acquainted with great sword immortals Wa?" "They've been acquainted for a long time," Ningyao confirmed with a nod. Chen Pingan had written about this in his travel journal, and he had actually dedicated quite a number of paragraphs to describing his experiences with Suiyu. "Can you tell me a bit more?" Daizhong asked with a smile. "No, I can't. Ningyao replied with a shake of her head. Daizhong tugged at Ningyao's sleeve, gently swaying it back and forth as she put on a pout and said in a pitiful voice, "Just tell me anything, big sister Ning. There has to be something you can say." Ningyao pondered for a moment before replying, "You should ask Chen Pingan yourself when we return. He's planning to partner with you to open a shop, so you can use this as a condition for forming the partnership. Don't agree to his proposal too early." Daizhong quickly understood the implications of Ningyao's words, with the latter clearly laying a trap for her to walk into. Daizhong chuckled in anger and huffed, "I'm not planning to become business partners with him. Don't push your luck, Ningyao." Ningyao smiled and said, "I'm truly not siding with Chen Pingan over you, but the reality is that he was correct. You aren't clever enough when it comes to doing business. With his help, it's guaranteed that you can enjoy a large and steady income." Daizhong furrowed her brows, wanting to say something but ultimately deciding against it. Ningyao glanced at Daizhong and immediately read her mind, explaining, "Chen Pingan is carrying 1 pocket treasure and 2 minimization treasures, but apart from some ordinary wine from his hometown and a large pile of bamboo leaves, they're filled with nothing but empty space. He has almost nothing on him. If Chen Pingan truly wanted to travel to the Sword Chi Great Wall as a merchant like many on the intercontinental ships and rely on selling a bunch of miscellaneous items to earn money from us sword cultivators, then would he have wasted his treasures like this? He would have stuffed his pocket treasure and minimization treasures full of goods. Which is to say, Chen Pingan only wants to earn ethical money by forming a business partnership with you. This is out of habit, and Chen Pingan has always liked to earn money from a young age. However, this isn't due to a pure desire for wealth. I have to speak up and defend him in this regard." Daizhong felt a huge sense of relief, and a smile returned to her face as she said, "That's good then. Otherwise, I would have scolded him for being greedy and scummy to his face, and so be it if our friendship ended as soon as it began." Soon after the old scholar left, Suiyu lightly placed his pot of wine on the chair. He didn't like to drink wine, and suppressing his abundant sword chi was also very troublesome. Perhaps he was the only person in the world who complained about having too much sword chi. Chen Pingan was still taking small sips of wine, appearing quite carefree and relaxed. Suiyu chuckled coldly and asked, "Is it hard to feign calm and composure now that Master isn't here to help you anymore?" Chen Pingan firmly refused to speak. "You weren't aware that Master would come to the Sword Chi Great Wall before, so there was no issue with you asking Chan Qingdu for assistance," Suiyu said. "However, since Master visited just now, why didn't you take the opportunity to ask for his agreement? Whether Master agreed or not would have been his problem, but whether to ask or not is a matter of respect and etiquette for a disciple." Chen Pingan also placed his wine pot on the chair, placing his hands inside his opposite sleeves before leaning forward and gazing at the street that was currently being repaired. "I'm aware of Master's current state, so could I still open my mouth to ask this question? What would that achieve apart from making Master feel troubled? Even if Master doesn't feel troubled, will my conscience not feel uneasy? Even if I don't feel uneasy, what happens when this matter causes trouble for the entire Sword Chi Great Wall, becoming the spark that directly triggers an all-out battle between the two sides? If that were the case, would Master truly not feel troubled when he departed?" Zuyu nodded in response, approving Chen Pingan's answer. Master had many things to worry about, so it was only appropriate that his disciples should shoulder some of the burdens and responsibilities. Zuyu recalled the tall and sturdy Mao Xiaodong, though his recollection of this unofficial disciple was slightly hazy. He only remembered Mao Xiaodong as a young man who had earnestly studied and sought knowledge all year round. He wasn't part of the brightest group of unofficial disciples, with his understanding and comprehension abilities being relatively slow. Mao Xiaodong always liked to ask for clarification regarding scholarly questions, and Cui Chan often joked that he was a dim-witted blockhead. Cui Chan would only give the final answer, and he would never be willing to go into more detail. Only Little Chi would be patient enough to entertain Mao Xiaodong. Mao Xiaodong was unwilling to enter the school of rites to shelter from trouble in the beginning, insisting on tying himself to the scholarly lineage. He also wanted to accompany Little Chi to the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent to establish Mountain Cliff Academy. Zuyu recounted slowly. Master actually said something very harsh back then, saying that Mao Xiaodong shouldn't have such selfish thoughts, seeking only to appease his own conscience. Why couldn't he elevate his ambitions to the next level? There was no need to stubbornly cling to one lineage, and if he could use a greater knowledge to benefit the world, it mattered little whether he belonged to the scholarly lineage or not. After hearing this, Mao Xiaodong, whom I never really held in high regard, said something that impressed me greatly. He screamed at the top of his lungs, saying to Master that he was slow and untalented, but he knew that only by respecting his master could he uphold Tao and be free from guilt. The sequential order of these matters couldn't be swapped. Master was both happy and sad to hear this, but he no longer forced Mao Xiaodong to leave the scholarly lineage and join the etiquette lineage. Chen Pingan grabbed his pot of wine and took a sip, saying, "Senior brother Mao was extremely hospitable both times I visited the great Sui nation's Mountain Cliff Academy. He was afraid that I would venture down the wrong paths, so he appeared much like a Confucian sage and teacher when he explained some principles to me." Zuiyu smiled and remarked, "Well, that's because you didn't see his speechless expression when I put him in a chokehold." Regardless of how reasonable his response was, he shouldn't have sent spittle flying all over Master's face, should he? "What do you say, junior brother?" Chen Pingan quietly put his pot of wine back on the chair, simply responding with a nod and stubbornly refusing to say anything extra. Zuiyu stood up, grabbing his pot of wine from the chair before shooting a glance at the food container beside his feet. Chen Pingan stood up and said, "I'll pay for this." Zuiyu shot another glance at Chen Pingan. Chen Pingan had no option but to add, "And I'll continue to do so in the future." Only after hearing this did Zuiyu prepare to leave. "I hope I didn't disappoint you, senior brother Zua," Chen Pingan suddenly said. Zuiyu remained silent for a moment before saying slowly, "You did okay." Chen Pingan breathed a sigh of relief and chuckled. "That's good then." Zuiyu hesitated for a moment and eventually said, "From today onward, if anyone speaks to you in a taunting manner and accuses you of receiving protection and enjoying today's success simply because you belong to the scholarly lineage, then there's no need to speak nonsense with them. You can directly send a messenger flying sword to the city wall, and I'll teach them what respect means." Chen Pingan was rendered speechless. He was truly quite unaccustomed to this. Zuiyu paused briefly and added, "I'll teach their parents and seniors the meaning of respect as well." Seeing that Zuiyu was becoming slightly impatient and seemingly wanting to teach him sword techniques, Chen Pingan was reminded of a saying popular among vagrant cultivators: "Better to sacrifice someone else than to sacrifice oneself." With this in mind, he hurriedly nodded and replied, "I'll keep this in mind." Zuiyu didn't go to great pains to suppress his sword chi any longer, transforming into a streak of brilliant light as he returned to the distant city wall. As Zuiyu soared from the city to the city wall, his abundant sword chi caused the primordial sword intent that suffused heaven and earth to briefly move aside and create a path. After arriving at the city wall, Zuiyu lightly raised his hand holding the wine pot, lifting his sleeve which held a bound book. This was a book that Chen Pingan had given to the scholarly sage just then. Yet the scholarly sage had secretly passed it on to him for some unknown reason. In fact, the scholarly sage had even hidden this from Chen Pingan, his most favored final disciple. Zuiyu used his sword chi to create an isolated small world, after which he started to drink wine and read. He placed the book on the parapet in front of him, relying on his sword chi to flip the pages when required. Before he knew it, Zuiyu had already finished the entire pot of wine. He gazed up at the sky, turning toward the direction where the scholarly sage had left. Master's smile remained the same even after becoming the most impoverished Confucian sage in the world, but Zuiyu knew that his master wasn't truly carefree and happy. Rather, the scholarly sage was feeling guilty about his disciples having to disperse and drift around the world. Things were only different when Master saw his junior brother, someone whose ego was higher than the heavens, and who was finally willing to acknowledge the scholarly sage as his master. Even though Master had spoken little and smiled little, having already departed from the sword chi Great Wall as well, he was definitely beaming from ear to ear right now. Perhaps Chen Pingan wasn't aware that if he had hurriedly rushed to the city wall to greet his senior brother upon arriving at the sword chi Great Wall and hearing that Zuiyu was there, then Zuiyu would have indeed felt disappointed. How could little Chi choose such a junior brother? If Chen Pingan had secretly constructed an ancestral hall at home and hung up Master's portrait, yet he actively sought praise from Zuiyu because of this, then Zuoyu would have felt even more disappointed. How could Master choose such a closing disciple? If Chen Pingan wanted to learn sword techniques because he felt like Zuoyu was a skilled swordsman, then Zuoyu would have felt most disappointed. Why should he accept such a junior brother? However, Chen Pingan didn't do any of these things. This was the junior brother that Zuoyu had waited 100 years for. In fact, he was even better than the ideal junior brother that had existed in Zuoyu's mind. When parting ways at the Flood Dragon Trench back then, there was one thing that Zuoyu hadn't said. He had hoped that Chen Pingan could do one thing. To his surprise, Chen Pingan had not only done this thing, but he had even done it very well. He had traveled across 3 continents and witnessed their mountains and waters. Thus, Zuoyu finally realized why Master had purposely given the book to him after reading its contents. At this moment, Zuoyu wondered to himself whether his hesitant response of, "You did okay," to Chen Pingan at the shop entrance back then had hurt his junior brother's feelings. Perhaps Master would have smacked him across the head again if he were present. Zuoyu's gaze lingered on the sky for a long time. The Tao of heaven and earth was vast, substantial, lofty, brilliant, far-reaching and long-lasting. A pity. Worry weighs on my heart, yet I can feel it flowing away with time, with no chance to address it. Chen Pingan breathed a sigh of relief after Zuoyu left without drawing his sword. He would be lying to himself if he said he wasn't nervous, and he hurriedly placed the chair and stools back inside the shop before sitting down on the door threshold, waiting for Ningyao and Daizhong to return. Zuoyu had come silently, but he hadn't concealed his sword qi on purpose when leaving. Thus, more than half of the sword immortals at the sword qi Great Wall were most likely able to detect Zuoyu's trip away from the city wall. In any case, Zuoyu's act of openly sitting at the entrance of the shop just then was a silent message in and of itself. Before Zuoyu's arrival at the shop, the old scholar had actually activated a mystical ability and created a barrier, allowing only those at the shop to detect his presence. He had then retracted this barrier following Zuoyu's arrival. Those in the scholarly lineage always worried about many things, but when they decided to act, they would always be extremely resolute. As a result, they would appear as unreasonable as could be. When Ningyao and Daizhong returned, Chen Pingan stood up and said with a smile, "Sorry for inconveniencing you, Miss Daizhong. I had to host some guests here." Daizhong smiled. "I won't ask about the old mister's identity, but why did great sword immortals voluntarily come over to drink wine with you? I need to ask about this, lest all of the items in my shop mysteriously disappear in the future. Who would I complain to at that time? Zuoyu is my senior brother, and the person sitting in the middle just then was our master majestic world scholarly sage," Chen Pingan revealed. His background and identity wouldn't help him much at the Sword Qi Great Wall, as they would not help him avoid a single battle. He still had to fight those necessary battles no matter what. In any case, what Cui Dongshan had said was correct. He had won over his master and his senior brother through his own abilities, so there was no need to purposely keep their relationships hidden. Daizhong silently walked into the shop. There was no way to continue this conversation. Ningyao sat beside Chen Pingan on the door threshold and said in a soft voice. Thankfully, the old great sword immortal was personally keeping an eye on the city wall just then, not allowing a single person to travel south for whatever reason. Otherwise, you would have faced immense danger in the next battle. The demon tribe has many schemes. Master and senior brothers are both aware of this, Chen Pingan reassured with a smile. Ningyao nodded and asked, "What are you planning to do next?" "Cultivate in earnest, refine more qi, strive to advance to the abode tier as soon as possible, perform advanced refinement on 1st and 15th and transform them into bonded items, and temper my Vajra body tier at the same time," Chen Pingan replied. "Things will be much easier in battle after I advance to the far-roaming tier. However, my last 2 goals are very difficult to achieve at the moment, and just focusing on gathering bonded items of the 5 elements alone, this task already poses monumental difficulty. Bonded items of the metal element and fire element are exceptionally rare and can only be obtained through fortune, so if things truly don't work out, I won't try to purposely look for bonded items of superior grade. I need to build my bridge of immortality to face the next great battle first, after all. Ningyao, you don't need to persuade me one way or another regarding this matter. I've already gone over the pros and cons very carefully, and disregarding the other matters of cultivation and only focusing on bonded items, The grades of my 3 current bonded items are already enough to help me advance to the level of Earth Immortal and perhaps the unpolished Jade tier. I can't have overly high ideals and expectations regarding this matter, since one indeed can't walk too slowly on the path of cultivation. Otherwise, my spiritual energy will inevitably become scattered if I'm unable to advance to the middle 5 tiers for a long time. Yet my martial arts cultivation base has already reached the 7th tier. When I circulate my true chi, it will, to a greater or smaller extent, collide with my spiritual energy and affect my combat power. So, in the meantime, Chen Pingan frowned in worry as he said this, and he heaved a sigh before continuing. I still need to learn sword techniques from senior brother. Isn't that quite good? Ning Yao replied. Seniors was the most suitable and the most qualified person to teach you sword techniques. Don't forget that your senior brother isn't an innate sword talent either. I can't lie in the sickbed and drink medicine at the Ning residence every few days, can I? Chen Pingan replied in helplessness. Ning Yao chuckled and said, That's okay. I learned how to brew medicine from you back in the Jewel's small world, but I've never had the opportunity to use this skill. Chen Pingan tried to restrain himself once, twice, and 3 times, but he eventually couldn't help but say, It's not like I haven't seen you brew medicine before. I wouldn't dare to drink the medicine even if you dare to brew it. Ning Yao clicked her tongue and remarked, Tisk, you're speaking quite tough after acknowledging your senior brother. Chen Pingan immediately put on a pitiful expression and relented. I'll drink it. I'll pretend it's wine and drink it. Daizhong shook her head in envy as she looked at the couple in the doorway. Chen Pingan recalled something, and he turned around and proposed with a smile. Miss Daizhong, how about we split the profits 40-60 if I help the shop bring in money? Will that be too little for you? Daizhong asked with a smile. Then how about 30-70? Chen Pingan replied. Miss Daizhong, you truly like to take big risks when it comes to doing business. It's no wonder that your shop is doing so. Well, Daizhong was rendered speechless with anger. There was a look of amused schadenfreude on Ning Yao's face. Chen Pingan smiled and said, Even immortals will struggle to make money at this miscellaneous shop. He chuckled. I knew that I would be staying at the Sword Chi Great Wall for an extended period this time, so I brought some extra wine of the ordinary ilk from my hometown. How about we open a small wine shop together? We don't need to be afraid of customers having nowhere to sit as long as we place a few additional chairs and tables outside. If the wine is good, then it will taste good even if they drink it while squatting down. You already admitted that it's ordinary wine from the markets, so even if there are a lot of alcoholics here, there will ultimately come a time when the wine runs out, even if they're willing to buy this wine, Daizhong said in curiosity. In any case, selling the wine for a high price can easily ruin the shop's reputation. I'm not shameless enough to scam other people. Chen Pingan retrieved a verdant green bamboo leaf that was lush and filled with spiritual energy, replying, The price of the wine will rise astronomically after I put this in the wine pot. Of course, this will be the first-grade wine sold by our wine shop. For the second-grade wine, we'll put a few bamboo leaves in a large wine vat. In addition, I also have this. He opened his hands, revealing a wine insect that he had borrowed from Wei Bo, because talking about his transactions with a friend like Wei Bo would hurt their feelings. Wine insects were extremely rare and precious creatures, even in Majestic World. It was only thanks to hosting 3-night travel banquets and giving some subtle hints that some mountain or water god had finally parted ways with the wine insect with great reluctance. In fact, this deity had only been willing to offer up the wine insect after Wei Bo subtly hinted that they wouldn't need to attend the 4th-night travel banquet as compensation. Chen Pingan was brimming with confidence as he continued, I've already done some tests, and wine improved with wine insect alone still can't be regarded as a very good wine. It's still very lacking compared to those exorbitantly expensive immortal wines. However, adding the bamboo leaves will completely transform the wine's flavor. So we need to purchase as much cheap and ordinary wine as possible before we open our wine shop. The more we buy, the better, and we can store them away and only open our doors for business when we have enough wine. We probably can't get a bargain if we go and purchase wine ourselves, and will likely draw suspicion if we buy too much. This being the case, we can give Yanzhua and Chen Sancho a cut of the profits. A small percentage will do, and there's no need to give them too much. They're already rich enough as it is, unlike us two poor people. Ning Yao leaned against the doorframe of the shop as she looked at Chen Pingan, who was especially spirited and energetic as he talked about business. Daizhong felt slightly hesitant. This wasn't about whether or not they should purchase cheap wine. She no longer had any doubts about this, and she was confident that they could make money. It was simply a question of how much money they could make. Moreover, they would be earning money from those wealthy sword cultivators and sword immortals, and Daizhong didn't feel an iota of guilt about this. These cultivators and immortals would be drinking wine regardless. What Daizhong was hesitant about right now was the same thing as before, dragging Fatty Yen and Chan Sancho into this business venture. According to her original intentions, she would rather earn less money and face a higher cost price than ask her friends for help. If it weren't for Chen Pingan mentioning that they could take a cut of the profits, Daizhong would have rejected his suggestion outright. Chen Pingan was in no hurry, and he placed the wine insect inside his sleeve and returned the bamboo leaf to his minimization treasure. There was a large pile of bamboo leaves and bamboo branches inside, with Chen Pingan having brought all of them to the Sword Chi Great Wall. He smiled faintly and said, "Miss Daizhong, please excuse me for being blunt, but you truly need to fix your attitude when it comes to doing business. Speaking business, it's correct not to involve your friends if you feel like the profits and losses of the venture are uncertain. However, it will be inconsiderate of us not to involve our friends if we're certain that the business venture is definitely going to profit. Anyhow, it's also okay if Miss Daizhong genuinely feels like my suggestion is inappropriate. In that case, we can simply open a smaller wine shop, meaning slightly higher cost, less stock, and less profit. We can discuss this matter again once we've earned enough money, and there's no need to feel concerned about pushing things back." Daizhong was seemingly facing a new dilemma now, worried that Chen Pingan would hold a grudge against her if she turned down his genuinely good idea. Chen Pingan smiled and asked, "Then it's a deal? A 30-70 split in my favor?" Daizhong smiled and replied, "50-50. Both the wine and the shop are equally as important. Isn't it also a wine shop if I grab a few tables and chairs and casually place them in some empty space on the street?" Chen Pingan retorted, "I refuse to believe that Ning Yao can stand losing face like this. Even if Ning Yao doesn't mind, can you, Chen Pingan, truly bring yourself to embarrass her?" Daizhong interrogated. Chen Pingan was left slightly speechless. Ning Yao was just about to say something. "Ning Yao," Daizhong hurriedly exclaimed. "We've been friends for so many years, so you can't forget about your friend after finding yourself a partner." Ning Yao had initially wanted to say that she wouldn't even mind helping out and hollering to sell wine, so would she mind setting up a wine shop on the streets using some random tables and chairs? However, Ning Yao didn't have the heart to say this after hearing Daizhong's frantic remark, and thus she eventually haggled with Chen Pingan to get a 40-60 split in Chen Pingan's favor. Chen Pingan's reason was that he had won 4 battles in a row, allowing this street to become renowned throughout the Sword Chi Great Wall. As such, his selling wine would bring great repute to the wine shop at no cost, allowing them to attract more customers. Daizhong was truly quite impressed by his shamelessness and his ability to make money. In the end, however, she still asked, "Chen Pingan, are you really not worried about losing face for the Ning residents and the Yao clan's elders by selling wine and making some small money like this?" Chen Pingan smiled and shot back with a question of his own, asking, "Have you forgotten about my background, Miss Daizhong? I don't steal, don't rob, don't cheat, and don't scam, so each copper coin I earn is a result of my ability." Ning Yao held back a smile. Chen Pingan was in love with money, so if the shop opened but failed to attract customers in the beginning, he would go as far as to sell wine to the old great sword immortal. Daizhong fell silent for a long time before whispering, "I feel like our wine shop will be cheating people." Chen Pingan waved a hand and boasted without shame, "We'll clearly display the price, and the customers can either take it or leave it. There won't be any need to worry about the sales avenues in the future, and to be blunt, it will be completely up to our mood whether we want to sell wine or not." Daizhong felt slightly more at ease after hearing this. It had always been Daizhong's dream to become rich and buy a big house, but she had enough self-awareness to realize that finding the right business opportunity to earn money truly wasn't her strong suit. Daizhong initially thought that Chen Pingan and Ning Yao would return to the Ning residence after they finished the negotiations and reached a deal, but Chen Pingan unexpectedly stood behind the counter and grabbed an abacus. This puzzled Daizhong greatly, and she asked, Aren't we just purchasing some wine to build stock? This is a very simple task that I'll be capable of handling. There was a genuinely stunned expression on Chen Pingan's face. He wasn't feigning shock this time, and he asked with a frustrated chuckle, "Do there exist such simple business transactions in the world? Miss Dai, I'm already starting to question my decision to partner with you. Just think for a moment. We first need to choose a restaurant or a wine shop with relatively poor business to purchase wine from, right? At that time, how should we haggle for a better price? And how can we get a discount if we purchase in bulk? How can we say the right things to the right people? Do we not need to think over these matters first? How can we lock in a contract to prevent our supplier from going back on the agreement and refusing to sell us wine after they see the success of our wine shop? Even if they back out, there needs to be a clause in the contract detailing the compensation they owe us if they choose to go down this path. There are many different considerations and a great deal of fine details to iron out, and I surmise that you definitely won't be able to discuss these details and close out a deal by yourself. So be it. I'll put on a face mask afterward and have you sit beside me to observe. I'll demonstrate the process to you first. In any case, what I mentioned was only the rough outline regarding how to purchase wine from other people. The other aspect is opening a new shop. We need to invite some wine drinkers to act like so-called passersby to create some atmosphere and excitement. So what kind of sword cultivators at what cultivation base should we invite? Do we not need to work through this and privately promise them a certain number of pots of high-grade bamboo leaf wine? Wine that will be incredibly difficult to purchase in the future? And which sword immortal should we ask to make loud and nonsensical proclamations about purchasing all of our wine? Who would be more suitable for this? And who can do this without appearing suspicious and clearly in cahoots with us? Do we not need to mull over these matters? Thinking a bit further, how should we clearly and fairly split the profits with our alcoholic friends in Fatty Yen and Chan Sancho after we make money? We're doing small business here, so we definitely can't sell wine on credit. We need to plan everything out as early as possible, don't you think? Dai Zhang became completely deflated, feeling increasingly uncertain as she listened to Chen Pingan go on and on from behind the counter. In the end, Dai Zhang started to feel like maybe she truly wasn't cut out for doing business? Why did she suddenly feel like doing business was even more difficult than practicing sword techniques? Ning Yao smiled faintly and snacked on roasted seeds as she stood beside the counter. When Chen Pingan finished, Dai Zhang said in a meek voice, "Chen Pingan, how about we split the profits 30-70 in your favor? I'm fine with just 30%. Chen Pingan was just about to nod and accept Dai Zhang's offer. However, he was immediately struck by Ning Yao's elbow, causing him to immediately smile and reply, "There's no need. We can split the profits 50-50 as we discussed in the beginning. There needs to be sincerity when doing business." Chen Pingan turned to his side and signaled to Dai Zhang with his eyes. He had already shown sincerity, so it was only right for Miss Dai Zhang to show some sincerity as well, right? They should each take a backward step and settle at a 40-60 split in Chen Pingan's favor again. Dai Zhang nodded before turning to Ning Yao with an innocent expression and saying, "Ning Yao, Chen Pingan is secretly winking at me. I'm not sure what this means." Chen Pingan suffered another blow from Ning Yao's elbow, causing him to grimace in pain as he raised a thumb at Dai Zhang and remarked, "Miss Dai Zhang is indeed a quick learner when it comes to doing business." They discussed many more details. Dai Zhang carefully committed everything to memory. Chen Pingan and Ning Yao left the small miscellaneous shop, and as they walked along the street and passed by the wine shops, Chen Pingan smiled and said, "These shops will all be our competitors in the future." "Thank you," Ning Yao said in a soft voice. "I was doing what I needed to," Chen Pingan replied with a smile. Ning Yao hesitated for a moment before asking, "Dai Zhang likes a noble scholar from a Confucian school in the Middle Earth Divine Continent. Are you able to straighten her out?" Chen Pingan smiled wryly and said, "There are some things I can help with, but I truly can't help with this kind of matter." Ning Yao clasped her hands behind her back and praised slowly, "Don't you have a very good understanding of romantic relationships? Oh, great conscience of heaven and earth! I don't understand this at all." Chen Pingan replied in a resolute voice. Dai Zhang's small residence, which was hidden inside a small alley, was already filled with a great number of large wine vats. She didn't have enough money left to purchase more wine, and even though Chen Pingan still had 10 grain rain coins in his possession, he naturally couldn't use a grain rain coin to purchase goods like a fool. Doing so would be encouraging the wine sellers to raise their prices as much as possible. This being the case, he asked Ningyao for a large pile of snowflake coins. Chen Pingan and Daizhong visited all of the restaurants and wine shops that sold poor quality wine at the Sword Qi Great Wall. And this was wine that wouldn't sell very well in the streets and alleys here. This was one strange aspect of the Sword Qi Great Wall. The sword cultivators who could afford wine weren't willing to drink this poor quality wine. And only those drunkard sword cultivators who owed too much wine money would pinch their noses and drink this inferior wine. Meanwhile, the proper immortal wine sold by the restaurants and wine shops was truly as expensive as flying swords. Immortal wine here was far more expensive than immortal wine at Stalactite Mountain, which was only a single gate away, and this caused even sword immortals to feel extremely vexed. This was especially the case since travel between Stalactite Mountain and the Sword Qi Great Wall had become subject to stricter control. It was becoming increasingly difficult for the alcoholics of the Sword Qi Great Wall to enjoy life. Chen Pingan bent down and opened up a wine vat, inside of which the wine insect was currently soaking. It was leisurely swimming around like a small fish, appearing drunk as it enjoyed itself to the fullest. Each vat of wine needed to host the wine insect for 3 days to transform into fine wine, and inside these vats were also a few bamboo leaves as well as a single bamboo segment. The wine wasn't named verdant bamboo leaf as Daizhong had suggested, nor was it named bamboo branch wine as Ningyao had suggested. Instead, Chen Pingan had named it bamboo sea small world wine, also known as azure divine mountain wine, and wouldn't take no for an answer. He even caused Daizhong, who was accustomed to doing business with a clear conscience, to gasp with absolute shock. Seeing this, Chen Pingan had spoken in a meaningful and heartfelt manner, saying that the bamboo leaves and bamboo branches were truly from the bamboo sea small world. As for whether they were from Azure Divine Mountain, he could inquire about this when the opportunity arose in the future. In the off chance that they weren't, they could simply drop the alternate name of Azure Divine Mountain Wine. Apart from preparing to open a wine shop to earn some money, Chen Pingan would also make sure to refine qi for 12 hours at the Ning residence every single day. He would occasionally refine qi for upwards of 14 to 18 hours. Ningyao vacated the pavilion at Dragon Slaying Cliff, spending more of her time practicing sword techniques at the training ground in the Minute Small World instead. When Chen Pingan rested, he would hold sword immortal and squat at the foot of the small mountain, earnestly tempering the blade of the sword. Fatty Yan and Dong Huafu would occasionally come over to visit, and whenever the former got the chance, he would insist that Chen Pingan spectate his deranged demon fist technique. Fatty Yan would muse whether practicing the sword had inhibited his extraordinary martial arts talent, and Chen Pingan would naturally nod and reply in the affirmative. Not only that, but Chen Pingan's reasons for his agreement would always be new and fresh, something that Chen Sancho found even more unbearable than Fatty Yan's fist technique. One time, Dong Huafu truly couldn't stand it anymore, and as he watched Fatty Yan's repulsive performance on the training ground, he had asked Chen Pingan whether the latter was speaking sincerely when he provided affirmation to Fatty Yan. Perhaps Fatty Yan was truly a martial arts prodigy? Chen Pingan had smiled and replied that Fatty Yan was, of course, not a martial arts prodigy. Only after hearing this had Dong Huafu felt slightly more at ease. Listening to their conversation, Chen Sancho had heaved a long sigh and slapped his forehead, lying down on the long bench. Meanwhile, a young girl whose sleeves were filled with desserts would arrive at the entrance of the Ning residence almost every single day, shouting that she wanted to become a disciple and learn martial arts. One time, she was dragged into the residence by Ning Yao and given a stern beating, and only then did she give it a rest for a single day. Unexpectedly, however, the young girl visited the following day again, though she had learned her lesson and immediately ran away after shouting that she wanted to become Chen Pingan's disciple and learn martial arts. She could sprint back and forth several times a day, and this wasn't an issue for her since she had nothing better to do anyway. Ning Yao eventually lay in waiting and blocked her path, twisting her ear and dragging her into the Ning residence. She let the young girl enjoy Fatty Yan's fist technique performance on the training ground, saying that this was the martial arts taught by Chen Pingan. This being the case, did she still want to become Chen Pingan's disciple and learn martial arts from him? Tears brimmed in the young girl's eyes, with her lips trembling as she replied that she still wanted to learn fist techniques even if this was the situation. She quietly wiped away her tears, choking back sobs as she commented in realization that this was the principle her mother had talked about. Only those who could endure the most difficult hardships would rise to become the most extraordinary people. Ning Yao was out of ideas, so she dragged Chen Pingan over to personally deal with this situation. Chen Pingan was discussing a matter of great significance with Grandma Bai and Grandpa Nalan, but Ning Yao didn't explain the situation at all as she led the confused Chen Pingan to the training ground. When he arrived, he was greeted by the sight of the young girl kneeling down to become his disciple. She wasn't an unfamiliar face, seeing that she had been the loudest and made the most fuss during his 4 battles on the street before. It had been impossible for Chen Pingan not to notice her. It wouldn't be appropriate for Chen Pingan to casually help the young girl up, so he hurriedly stepped to the side and avoided her bow before asking in helplessness, "Don't kowtow just yet. What's your name?" The young girl hurriedly stood up and replied in a loud voice, "Guozhujiu." Chen Pingan nodded in response before raising his left hand and performing some calculations. He then heaved a long sigh and remarked, "How unfortunate. Your name isn't suitable, so I'm temporarily unable to take you as a disciple. We can discuss this again in the future." There was a look of sincerity on Guozhujiu's face as she replied, "Master, how about I go home and ask my parents to change my name? I also don't like this name very much, and I've already tolerated it for many years." Chen Pingan shook his head and said, "That won't do. I look at fate when I take disciples, and the first aspect is to look at someone's name. If a person's name isn't suitable, then I'll need to wait for 3 years before looking at whether the timing is suitable. You'll still have an opportunity at that time." Guozhujiu felt extremely annoyed and disappointed, stomping her foot hard before running away. As she ran, she hollered that she was going to flip through the lunar almanac to pick an auspicious date 3 years in the future. Yin Zhua and Chan Sancho were transfixed with shock as they stood there, with their eyes almost popping out of their sockets. Guozhujiu was a strange child, and she had acted weirdly ever since she was little. She definitely couldn't be dismissed as stupid, and she was actually an extremely talented innate sword talent, one who was regarded as a future pillar of the Guo clan. However, she most definitely couldn't be praised as smart, seeing that the young girl had made a joke of herself too many times to even keep count. She was very literally the source of good laughs for those on the same street as Chan Sancho and the others. When she was little, Guozhujiu liked to run around with a bedsheet draped over herself, and she would never enter through the main door when she barged into people's houses. She liked to wander across the roof ridges and wall perimeters, and if it weren't for Dongbu beating her enough times and forcing her to change, Guozhujiu would have most likely still been acting the same way now. There was also a rumor that the Lord Hidden Official had actually chosen 2 potential candidates, Peng Yuanji and Guozhujiu. Chen Pingan was clearly in disbelief as he murmured, "Is she for real?" Chan Sancho smiled wryly and replied, "That depends on whether or not Guozhujiu shows up again tomorrow." Chen Pingan looked at Ning Yao. "It's difficult to say," Ning Yao said. Chen Pingan didn't think much about this matter, and he continued to discuss the important matters with his elders. Chen Pingan naturally wouldn't rush the old greatsword immortal regarding the latter acting as a matchmaker and visiting the Yao clan to propose a marriage. Inside the wing room where Chen Pingan was staying, Grandma Bai smiled and asked, "What was the matter?" Chen Pingan smiled and replied, "It was that young girl Guozhujiu again. She wants to become my disciple and learn martial arts, but I made up some excuses and turned her down. Taking an unofficial disciple with no effort would have actually been quite good," Nalan Yeshing said in amusement. Chen Pingan smiled bitterly and shook his head, saying, "I can't be too casual about such a major matter. The Guo clan has always been friends with the Ning residents, and there has never been a break in our relationship," Grandma Bai said. Chen Pingan faltered for a moment before turning to Grandma Bai with an inquiring look in his eyes. Grandma Bai nodded and replied, "They're the only ones." Following the clan leader's passing, the entire Guo clan visited the Ning residents to pay their respects. Afterward, the clan leader of the Guo clan bluntly disagreed with the Qi clan sword immortal regarding the matter pertaining to dragon-slaying Cliff. Otherwise, if it were a young girl from any other clan causing a ruckus like this, young mistress wouldn't have dragged her into the Ning residence 2 times. In saying this, you don't need to treat the young girl's request to become your disciple and learn martial arts too seriously. I'll give some serious thought to this matter related to Guozhujiu," Chen Pingan said in a solemn voice. Nalan Yeshing smiled and said, "There's no hurry. Why don't we talk about young Master Chen's fourth bonded item? Young Master Chen will truly understand the concept of cultivation once his bridge of immortality is erected. Before that, you can just barely become a sword cultivator, even though you don't possess the aptitude of an innate sword talent. You shouldn't underestimate this notion of just barely, as there exists a huge gulf between chi refiners who are sword cultivators and chi refiners who aren't. Young Master Chen can feel free to discuss this matter privately with the old great sword immortal." One morning, a shabby-looking wine shop opened its doors for the first time in the Sword Chi Great Wall. And the shopkeeper at this wine shop was none other than Dai Zhang, the young sword cultivator with a single arm. Standing beside her was a young man in azure, and after he personally set off a huge string of explosively loud firecrackers, he cupped his fists at everyone in the surroundings with a dazzling smile. If it weren't for the fact that Dai Zhang was already the owner of this wine shop, she had already invested everything, and there was no backing out anymore. She would have actually liked to sit inside the wine shop and pretend that this business had absolutely nothing to do with her. There were many tables placed in front of them. Ning Yao, Yan Zhua, and the others were hiding inside the wine shop that was filled with wine vats and wine pots of varying sizes. As shameless as Fatty Yen was, and even for someone who didn't understand shame like Dong Huafu, they still didn't have the face to walk outside and show themselves at this moment. The repairs on the street had just finished, and the shopkeepers and shop attendants of the other restaurants and wine shops were all standing at the entrances of their businesses and cursing in displeasure. This was because hanging beside the entrance of the shabby little wine shop was a couplet supposedly written by that young martial artist. 3 feet sword in hand, the sword immortal looks around lost. For where are the opponents to quell this hero's loneliness? A small cup of wine, together we dispel eternal sorrow. Till we become drunk, for what does money matter? Very well. How impressive of you. Pure martial artist Chen Pingan. Can you please have some shame, outsider? Not only that, but the wine being sold by this shabby little shop was apparently related to the Bamboo Sea Small World's Azure Divine Mountain or whatnot. What does money matter? If money didn't matter, then why the hell was he opening a shop to make money? There was the sound of whistling and cheering along the street. Dai Zhang was an easily embarrassed person, so her expression had already become tense as beads of sweat formed on her forehead. She tried her best to remain composed, and she couldn't help but ask, "Chen Pingan, can we truly sell half a vat of wine?" Chen Pingan smiled faintly and responded, "Even if no one comes to support us, following the plan I laid out beforehand will ensure that everything goes smoothly and money continues to flow in. Of course, it will naturally be better if someone visits to purchase wine. In any case, it's very normal for business to be slow during the early morning." 15 minutes later, Dai Zhang started to feel increasingly anxious as not a single customer visited the wine shop. 50% off the first pot of wine sold. First come, first serve, and this offer is only available for a single pot of wine. Chen Pingan shouted at the top of his lungs. And thus, a customer truly visited the wine shop. Is he also someone you invited over? Dai Zhang asked in puzzlement. Chen Pingan was also slightly surprised, and he shook his head and replied, "Of course not. The first customer was Peng Yuanji." He sat down on a bench before smiling widely and saying, "Give me a pot of the cheapest wine. Don't forget to give me the 50% discount." Chen Pingan turned around and glanced at the dazed Dai Zhang, chuckling softly and saying, "What are you standing there in a daze for? The shopkeeper should personally serve this pot of wine." Dai Zhang hurriedly grabbed a pot of Bamboo Sea Small World wine and a large white bowl, placing them on the table in front of Peng Yuanji. Guilt weighed on her conscience as she cracked open the recently packaged wine and poured out a bowl, so she forced a smile and said in an extremely quiet voice, "Please enjoy the wine." Chen Pingan grabbed an extra bowl and sat down at Peng Yuanji's table, pouring himself a bowl of wine without asking before smiling and saying, "Thank you for the support, brother Yuanji. I have to thank you with a toast. Looking at your generosity, brother Yuanji, there's no doubt that you'll become a sword immortal in the future. I'll drink first to show my respect." Dai Zhang felt a strong urge to dig a hole and disappear into the ground as she watched on. After all, what kind of shopkeeper would drink their customers' wine? After Chen Pingan finished the bowl of wine, Peng Yuanji surprisingly poured him another bowl. However, this wasn't a full bowl, seeing that the pot of wine wasn't very big to begin with. How many bowls of wine did it contain? Thankfully, the white bowls meticulously chosen by this wine shop weren't very big, and it was because of this that a pot of wine appeared to be big enough. Peng Yuanji was starting to feel slight regret about coming here to support the wine shop. So be it if business was poor in the future, but what if business started to boom? Would he not scold himself to death at that time? He lowered his head and smelled the wine, discovering that it genuinely smelled a little like immortal wine. It was better than he had imagined. However, a pot only cost a single snowflake coin, so wasn't this pricing a bit too low? Wine of this caliber would be sold for at least a few snowflake coins in the other restaurants and wine shops in the Sword Chi Great Wall. However, there was one thing that Peng Yuanji knew for sure. To say nothing of the Sword Chi Great Wall, no one in the entire world would sell wine for a loss. Chen Pingan and Peng Yuanji touched bowls before downing the wine. Afterward, Chen Pingan went inside to grab another pot of wine, placing it on the table and saying with a smile, "It's half price, so I'll only charge brother Yuanji 1 snowflake coin for 2 pots of wine." The wine tasted decent, so Peng Yuanji decided to tolerate Chen Pingan's behavior. After finishing 1 pot of wine, Peng Yuanji grabbed the other pot that Chen Pingan was just about to help him open, slapping 1 snowflake coin on the table and standing up to leave, saying that he would visit again in the future. Dai Zhang wiped away the sweat on her forehead and accepted the snowflake coin from Chen Pingan, a beaming smile on her face. Approximately 1 hour later, just when Dai Zhang was starting to worry about the business of the wine shop again, another customer arrived on the wind and gracefully landed in front of the shop. Dai Zhang couldn't help but turn around and look at Chen Pingan. After Chen Pingan clarified that this was still an unexpected surprise, Dai Zhang was surprised to see that he appeared a little nervous. The customer was the Wind Snow Temple's sword immortal Wei Jin, someone who also hailed from the Eastern Treasured Vile continent like Chen Pingan. Wei Jin asked for a pot of the most expensive wine, which came in at a cost of 5 snowflake coins. There was a bamboo leaf inside this wine pot. Wei Jin was in no hurry to start drinking, and he asked with a chuckle, "Is she still well?" Chen Pingan felt like he was sitting on a bed of needles at this moment, yet he couldn't play stupid and act dumb in front of someone like Wei Jin. Thus, he could only smile wryly and reply, "She's most likely doing very well, seeing that she's already become a sect leader. However, I was almost killed by her at Malicious Ghost Alley. Was Wei Jin here to cause trouble?" Chen Pingan hadn't hidden anything from Ningyao about He Xiaoyang, who had initially been a Taoist nun at the Divine Edict sect and was now a sect leader at the Refreshing sect. He had explained everything to her in detail. Fortunately, Ningyao hadn't displayed any anger about this, instead saying that He Xiaoyang had taken things slightly too far. She wanted to meet this sect leader in the future. Wei Jin insisted on opening Chen Pingan's old wounds today, causing Chen Pingan to feel a cold chill down his spine. He felt like the entire wine shop was flooded with eerie sword chi. After finishing a bowl of wine, Wei Jin asked, "Does she truly like you?" "I'm not sure," Chen Pingan replied with a shake of his head. Wei Jin nodded and poured himself another bowl of wine, downing it in a single gulp before chuckling. "There's no need to accompany me, shopkeeper. You can deal with your other matters." In the end, Wei Jin sat by himself and continued to drink wine, slowly but not stopping. Men who were strongly attracted to a particular woman often liked to drink so-called heartbreak wine. However, the person holding the blade and breaking their hearts would always be the person whom they loved, but was never beside them. Chen Pingan squatted down beside the shop in trance with his back facing the shop, unable to smile even though he was making money. Instead, he was feeling as worried as could be. This was because Wei Jin had slapped a lesser heat coin onto the table after drinking the 3rd bowl of wine, saying that they could deduct payment from this immortal coin when he came here to drink wine in the future. Fatty Yen and Chan Sancho tactfully kept their mouths shut. However, the slightly dim Dong Huafu stupidly commented, "I feel like there's a story to be told here." Chen Pingan finally understood why Fatty Yen and Chan Sancho were sometimes very afraid of Dong Huafu opening his mouth to speak. His words were like flying swords, truly sharp enough to stab someone to death. Wei Jin was yet to stand up and piss off, but Chen Pingan felt hugely relieved as he hurriedly stood up. As it turned out, Guizhuzhou had dragged a bunch of other children over, noisily making their way over to support the newly opened wine shop. Guizhuzhou didn't beat around the bush. directly revealing her intentions to Chen Pingan, as she respectfully referred to him as future master in 3 years. She continued, "My friends and I just learned about this new wine shop opening here, so we've come here to buy some wine as presents for our parents and elders. Future master in 3 years, I truly didn't force them to come here." Guozhuzhou then signaled to the other children with her eyes. The young girls, whom Guozhuzhou had especially visited late last night to give a reminder to, appeared listless as they obediently handed over the money and accepted the wine. They then waited for Guozhuzhou's instructions. They truly didn't care about the 3 snowflake coins they were earning from Guozhuzhou. Guozhuzhou had already pestered them for many days. Some of them had wanted to directly hand Guozhuzhou 6 snowflake coins instead, but Guozhuzhou had turned down this offer, insisting that they needed to gather enough people. In the end, Guozhuzhou also retrieved 3 snowflake coins to purchase a pot of wine, not forgetting to explain once again, "Future master in 3 years, they're all voluntarily here to purchase wine. I performed some calculations, and the 3 years can be halved to 1.5 years. I can reconsider your request again at that time," Chen Pingan replied in earnest. Guozhuzhou held the pot of wine in one hand and fist pumped with the other, exclaiming in delight, "Sure enough, today is an auspicious day to buy wine. I didn't memorize that old lunar almanac for nothing." With Peng Yuanji and Wei Jin's patronage, as well as the support from this group of young girls, the wine shop slowly saw some business. By the looks of it, it wouldn't be difficult to break even. This was already enough to have Daizhong feel overjoyed. She slowly became busier and busier. When it came to selling wine, they had agreed beforehand that Daizhong would need to do the bulk of the work. Chen Pingan couldn't keep an eye on the wine shop every single day. The extremely dumbfounded Dong Huafu had already been carried away by Chan Sanqiu and Fatty Yen. Ning Yao leaned against the counter in the wine shop, snacking on roasted seeds as she looked at Chen Pingan. "You're not angry, are you?" Chen Pingan asked in an uncertain voice. "How could I possibly be angry?" Ning Yao replied. There was a look of grief on Chen Pingan's face as he asked, "How could you possibly be angry, or how could you possibly not be angry?" "Guess." Ning Yao responded with a wink. Chen Pingan sighed in grief and lamented, "I'm going to open a pot of wine for myself. Keep it on my tab. Is he Xiaoyang worth my anger?" Ning Yao suddenly said with a smile. Standing in front of her, Chen Pingan asked in a quiet voice, "Do you know why I didn't feel frustrated after losing 3 battles in a row to Chao Xiai?" "Why?" Ning Yao asked. Chen Pingan smiled and revealed, "Because you couldn't be bothered remembering who Chao Xiai was." Chen Pingan also leaned against the counter, gazing at the customer sitting outside as he continued, "After seeing you, that impoverished child who grew up at Clay Vase Alley has never been short on money again." Ning Yao stopped snacking on roasted seeds as she looked at Chen Pingan's smile, which could no longer be hidden, and she asked, "Are you laughing at me for being scatterbrained?" Chen Pingan immediately wiped the smile from his face. In the next moment, he came to the realization that he was no smarter than the little girl, Guozhuzhou. He was also making his intentions as evident as could be. However, Ning Yao extended her hand and offered Chen Pingan some roasted seeds. She continued to snack on roasted seeds as she said, "I won't get angry about other women liking you." After pausing for a moment, she continued, "However, I'll feel very sad if you like a woman other than me in the future. If such a day truly comes, then you don't need to apologize to me, much less visit me to personally tell me the situation. I don't want to hear it." Chen Pingan reached over and placed a hand on Ning Yao's head, gently swaying it and saying, "Stop imagining things. It might be very difficult for me to become a lofty cultivator in my lifetime, especially since there are always taller mountains and more talented individuals. I can only try harder and put in more effort, striving to fulfill my promise one bit at a time. However, Chen Pingan will forever be the person who loves Ning Yao the most. There's no need to work on this anymore." Business was steadily improving at the new wine shop. However, Chen Pingan started to shirk his responsibilities as an owner. Whenever he was at the wine shop, he would surprisingly spend more of his time chatting with that group of children, sitting on a small stool outside, and even borrowing children's books from them. He would occasionally teach them how to read. Afterward, the young man in azure didn't try to make money in his spare time. Nor did he take advantage of the nearby dragon-slaying platform in the Ning residence to hurriedly temper his spiritual energy. Instead, he insisted on making rubbings of the stone tablets in the streets and alleys, collecting a large stack. Following this, he would often bask in the sun and become a storyteller, recounting some fantastical stories about mountain spirits and water ghosts of the majestic world to the group of children. After that, the young man would retrieve a bamboo branch and write on the ground whenever a child asked about a character they didn't know. He would roughly explain the character but not expand any further, only smiling and nodding even if the children peppered him with additional questions. After teaching them characters, the young man would talk about the mystical and wondrous matters of his home world. One day, the young man in azure who wore a jade hairpin taught the children some characters under the warm sun, after which he told some stories. He then placed the bamboo branch across his knees and recited in a quiet voice, "Lustrous is the sheepskin coat, dazzling golden in the sun." Seeing the young man stop, a child asked in curiosity, "And then? Is there more?" The young man placed his hands on his knees, gazing forward as he continued slowly. "Insects awaken during spring, vitality fills heaven and earth, all matter flourishes. Sleeping late and waking early, striding leisurely through courtyards, easing one's mind." None of the children surrounding the young man understood what he was saying, but they were willing to quietly listen to him recite these texts in a soft voice. In a relatively remote alley of the Sword Chi Great Wall, it was as if a small private school had sprung into existence, one without a genuine teacher and without genuine students. Autumn passed, and winter arrived, time strolling by at a leisurely pace. If it weren't for the fact that Chen Pingan could see the silhouette of the southern end of the Sword Chi Great Wall when he looked up, he would have almost mistakenly thought that he was at the white paper blessed land, or perhaps at the golden millet blessed land after drinking some forgetting sorrow wine. Even though Chen Pingan cultivated diligently without slacking off, in fact, he could be described as very busy, he still felt like this wasn't enough. Thus, he asked Grandma Bai to spar with him, yet Grandma Bai was unwilling to unleash deadly power, no matter what, and at most taught him some fist stances. Not satiated by the fist technique training sessions, Chen Pingan could only invite Grandpa Nalan to the training ground in the Minute Small World, allowing him to familiarize himself with the deadly power of an unpolished jade tear sword cultivator's flying sword. At the same time, Chen Pingan also learned some elementary stealth techniques from the so-called assassin, who had fallen from the immortal tier. There were many exquisite movements that pertained to the fundamental principles of cultivation, yet these movements could only be performed by sword cultivators. This left Chen Pingan feeling slightly disappointed. Besides cultivation, Chen Pingan would try his best to visit the wine shop whenever he had free time. He would stay for around 2 hours each time, though he wouldn't help much when it came to selling wine. Instead, he would sit amidst a large group of young children, continuing to play the role of a storyteller. At most, he would also teach them some characters and recite some poems and essays, ones that didn't pertain to any particular teachings or principles. Even though Chen Pingan was delegating all of his responsibilities, shopkeeper Daizhong didn't have any complaints at all. This was because the money-making strategies of the wine shop had all been devised by assistant shopkeeper Chen, so it was only reasonable for him to slack off now. Daizhong admitted that she had only invested some money and provided some ordinary labor, and in any case, Chen Pingan had done many more things following the successful opening of the wine shop. For example, he had plastered a brand new horizontal scroll above the entrance to complement the original couplet. "Those who drink my wine can advance." The shopkeepers of the other restaurants and wine shops on the street were nearing the brink of collapse. Not only had this new wine shop stolen a large chunk of their business, but most importantly, it clearly exuded a more impressive aura. This led to the restaurants and wine shops in the Sword Chi Great Wall clamoring to put up couplets and horizontal scrolls. Looking around and comparing, however, many alcoholic sword cultivators ultimately felt like the couplet at the new wine shop was the most appealing. Or to put it bluntly, it was the most shameless. After almost every single wine shop in the Sword Chi Great Wall started to put up couplets, the new wine shop promptly came up with a new marketing strategy. There were many small wooden tablets in the shape of peace and safety tablets hanging around the shop, each with an inscription by a sword cultivator customer of the wine shop. Daizhong would ask the customers to inscribe their names and some calligraphy works on the small wooden tablets. after which she would hang them on the wall as auspicious good luck charms. These wooden tablets weren't placed according to the customer's cultivation basis, and they were instead hung up by the customers themselves. The front side of these tablets would always be the customer's names, while the back side would be whatever they wanted to write. The wine shop didn't place any limit on how much or how little they could write. Of the customers that had already hung wooden tablets in the wine shop, 4 were surprisingly sword immortals at the upper 5 tiers. There was Wei Jin of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's Wind Snow Temple, Gao Kuei of the Sword Qi Great Wall, Yuan Qingshu of the Southern World Continent, and the unpolished Jade Tier Tao one of the Northern Complete Reed Continent, who had visited the wine shop alone late one night. All of them had left inscriptions on the backside of the wooden tablets, but this hadn't been by choice. They had initially inscribed their names on the front side only, but Chen Pingan had found opportunities to pester all of them afterward, forcing them to leave inscriptions on the backside as well. He had all kinds of methods to force compliance, and this had been an eye-opening experience for the embarrassed Dai Zhang. As it turned out, businesses could also be run like this. And thus Wei Jin's inscription read, "Troubled by love, sword unable to be drawn." Gao Kuei, the rugged-looking man with a single eye and a large beard, left the inscription, "May the flowers bloom, the moon be round, and people enjoy longevity." The elegant and carefree Yuan Qingshu had inscribed, "This world should know that I, Yuan Qingshu, am a sword immortal." Sword immortal Tao One was the most understanding, and after hearing that he could receive a free pot of bamboo sea small world wine, he immediately wrote, "The wine here is affordable and delicious, and it would be even better if buying on credit were allowed." Casting one's gaze over the youngest generation of prodigious sword cultivators, the wine shop had been graced with the presence of Pang Yuanji, Yan Zhua, Chan Sanqiu, Dong Huafu, and a dozen or so others. Of course, there was also the young girl, Guizhujiu, and apart from writing her name and her nickname Lu Duan, she had also made a secret inscription on the back, reading, "Master sells wine and this disciple buys wine. The relationship between master and disciple warms the heart and lasts for eternity." There were also quite a number of Earth Immortal sword cultivators who were too embarrassed to turn down the request of inscribing their names on the small wooden tablets, but many of them only inscribed their names and left the backsides blank. In any case, Chen Pingan seldom worked at the wine shop, while Dai Zhang was truly at a loss regarding how to ask the customers for this favor. Chen Pingan felt like this wasn't sustainable, so he handed Dai Zhang a few paper slips, saying that she could hand these over to nascent tier sword cultivators who appeared suitable and were actually willing to inscribe the small wooden tablets, but simply didn't know what to inscribe on the backside. She could hand over a paper slip when they paid. And thus, an old and abrasive nascent tier sword cultivator who had no experience with calligraphy had initially put on airs and turned down shopkeeper Dai Zhang's request, but after seeing one of the paper slips, he had unexpectedly changed his attitude straight away and secretly put away the slip, telling Dai Zhang to make haste and hand him a small wooden tablet. Appearing serious as if he were facing a great demon, the old sword cultivator had left an inscription according to the poetry line on the paper slip. When leaving, he had even purchased an additional slip of the most expensive Azure Divine Mountain wine. Purposely suppressing his sword chi as he drank to his heart's content, he had sung loudly while stumbling down the street. He repeated the same line again and again, the line of poetry that had suddenly come to him like a stroke of inspiration. Past glories not worth boasting about, countless battles fought over the years. Drunk and satisfied, my sword becomes my pillow, dreaming that the azure god visits to pour me wine. One day later, this nascent tier sword cultivator who mysteriously learned how to compose poems became extremely famous among the alcoholics and gambling addicts of the Sword Qi Great Wall. However, he was eventually struck by a sword immortal's flying sword from some unknown place, causing him to lie in a sickbed for several days. There was also a nascent tier sword cultivator from the Northern Complete Reed Continent who could still be considered young, and he regarded himself as someone who would occasionally attain enlightenment when drinking under the moonlight. The inscription on his wooden tablet read, "Half of the sword immortals in the world are my friends, which fine lady in the world isn't demure? I wash my sword with fine wine. Who doth say I'm not a free spirit?" The bamboo sea small world wine sold by the wine shop came in 3 grades, with the lowest grade costing 1 snowflake coin a pot and tasting the blandest. Medium grade bamboo sea small world wine tasted slightly better and cost 5 snowflake coins a pot, and the wine shop announced that one extremely valuable bamboo leaf from the bamboo sea small world would be hidden in each 100 pots. Sword immortal Wei Jin and Guozhujiu could both attest to this. High-grade Azure Divine Mountain wine cost 10 snowflake coins a pot, and there was no guarantee that customers would be able to purchase it, given that the wine shop would only sell a single pot a day. If a customer missed out, then they could only try again tomorrow. The small wine shop was always packed to the brim now, but after the initial popularity, there was no longer the sight of sword cultivators fighting to buy wine and squatting down on the streets to drink wine. Even so, the 6 tables would always be full. Dai Zhang was already very satisfied with the income of the wine shop, but she couldn't help but feel a slight sense of disappointment at the same time. Just like Chen Pingan had anticipated, purchasing wine became exceedingly difficult following the hugely successful opening of the wine shop. Many restaurants and wine shops would rather pay compensation to Dai Zhang than continue to sell her raw wine, making it abundantly clear that they wanted to see this new wine shop hung out to dry. If their customers were left empty-handed a few times, it wouldn't be long before their business started to tumble downhill. Indeed, being popular for a short while, and then betraying customer expectations was no way to run a business long-term. Even Dai Zhang was aware of this problem, so the assistant shopkeeper who liked to delegate work would naturally be even more aware of it. However, Chen Pingan never commented about this, and whenever he was at the wine shop, he would either chat with some regular customers and drink some free wine or mingle with the children at the alley corner and act like a storyteller. Dai Zhang didn't want to trouble Chen Pingan with everything, so she could only mull over the potential solutions herself. Late at night, Chen Pingan and Ning Yao arrived at the wine shop that was about to close. There were no customers in the shop. Dai Zhang retrieved the account book, and Chen Pingan sat to the side and retrieved 1 snowflake coin, purchasing a pot of the cheapest wine. This was the rule here. Even the shopkeepers needed to pay for wine. Chen Pingan carefully looked over the account book as he drank wine. Yanzhua and the others had also agreed beforehand that they would drink together today, the reason being that Chen Pingan was actually willing to treat them in a rare display. Chen Pingan and Ning Yao were sitting on the same bench. Yanzhua sat on a bench by himself, while Dong Huafu and Chen Sanqiu shared a bench. Yanzhua looked at Chen Pingan, who was carefully flipping over the account book, before glancing at Dai Zhang, who was sitting nearby. He couldn't help but ask, "Dai Zhang, you won't feel like Chen Pingan doesn't trust you, right?" Chen Pingan smiled knowingly, not looking up to say anything. Instead, he raised his wine bowl and took a sip of wine, essentially admitting guilt and thus willingly drinking in punishment. "What nonsense are you speaking?" Dai Zhang snapped. "Is this not the required rigor when doing business? We're running this business together because we're friends, so would our friendship end simply because we're double-checking the account books to make sure everything is correct? Who doesn't make mistakes? If these mistakes aren't picked up and corrected, then whose fault will it be in the future? Will everything be fine if we simply ignore the mistakes? If we carelessly and foolishly ignore each other's mistakes, won't we be throwing money away when the business starts to fall apart? Your favoritism is showing far too clearly, Dai Zhang. Why does it become friends doing business together when you talk about Chen Pingan? Then didn't I get beaten up for nothing in the past?" Yanzhua lamented in an aggrieved voice. "Didn't I apologize to you already?" Dai Zhang replied with a smile. "I was quite happy to hear you apologize back then, but now I can't help but feel that you weren't sincere enough," Yanzhua said sulkily. Chen Pingan flipped a page of the account book and remarked in amusement, "It always feels frustrating when your friend makes a new friend." Yanzhua waved a hand and corrected, "This isn't my point at all." Chen Pingan raised his wine bowl and touched it with Yanzhua's, saying with a smile, "I'm not making a casual comment about young Master Yan because you're so large and seemingly able to carry money everywhere. However, you stingily buy the cheapest wine every time, spending even less than the young girl, Miss Lu Duan." Dai Zhang appeared slightly hesitant, but she eventually mustered her courage and said, "Yanzhua Sanqiu, can I discuss something with the two of you?" Yanzhua was slightly puzzled, but Chen Sanqiu had seemingly guessed the reason already. He smiled and replied with a nod, "Of course." Yanzhua's eyes lit up as he asked, "Are you inviting the two of us into this business venture?" So my curiosity was correct. I took a glance at the wine vats at your residence, and taking into account the number of customers served at the wine shop each day, I knew that you would be running very low on wine. And now, the competing restaurants and wine shops are also very envious of your success, so trying to find a source of wine has become a colossal problem, right? No stress. This problem is easily solved. There's no need to even involve Sancho, seeing that he's a young master who never needs to put in any hard work. He's accustomed to lying down and enjoying good fortune, so he doesn't understand these kinds of matters at all. However, I'm different and I assist with a good number of businesses in my clan. As such, how difficult can it be to hook you up with some suppliers of cheap wine? Rest assured, Daizhong will follow the rules as you've stated, and I won't affect the Yin clan's business too much either. I'll try to make a small profit while also helping you earn some more. There was a complicated expression on Daizhang's face. Chen Pingan appeared slightly exasperated as he closed the account book and chuckled. There are two types of happiness for shopkeeper Daizhong when she makes money, with the first type of happiness coming from immortal coins landing in her pockets, as she works the abacus and calculates the earnings at the end of each day. The other type of happiness comes from the ability to earn money despite the challenges. Say, Fatty Yen, does this not sound reasonable? If you carry a sack of silver to the wine shop, I presume that Daizhong won't even be willing to plan ahead and check the accounts in the future. Fatty Yen, won't it be easier for you to directly give us a number? Yanzhuo was struck by realization as he replied, you could have told me earlier. Daizhong, I would have understood your intentions if you were this direct earlier. No. You're blaming me? Daizhong fumed. Yanzhuo drank wine and begged for forgiveness, saying, No, it's all my fault. My fault. Chen Pingan changed the topic, telling Daizhong what the key watchouts were regarding these profits and losses. In reality, it wasn't the case that Daizhong didn't understand these principles, and she had most likely understood them a long time ago. However, some of these matters pertain to rifts between friends, ones that could be big, small, existent, or non-existent. There were some unintentional words that had hurt other people, but she was unwilling to explain herself, lest she appear too deliberate. Or perhaps she was too embarrassed to explain herself. Things would be okay if she were lucky, and she would be able to delay these matters for a lifetime. These were only small matters after all, so she could make up for them by doing well at bigger matters. If she were unlucky, however, then friends would be lost, and it would no longer matter whether she explained herself or not. Every single person, including those sitting in the wine shop right now and including Ning Yao, needed to overcome the barrier in their heart. This wasn't a unique challenge for Daizhong, the only person among the original friend group who had grown up in an impoverished alley. Chen Pingan was merely borrowing this opportunity to gently touch on the problem as a bystander, helping the two people face the problem head-on. He couldn't have mentioned this problem too early, or else he would have put himself in a very awkward position. If he left it until it was too late, for example, when both Yanzhuo and Daizhong felt like he was one of their best friends, then the timing would become a little inappropriate. Chen Pingan couldn't speak these thoughts out loud, or else it would be like transforming fine wine into bland water. Thus, he could only mull over it himself, at times making him feel like he was manipulating people too much. The past Chen Pingan would have felt guilty and been riddled with self-doubt, but this was no longer the case. Each good intent needed to be protected and cherished by a greater good intent. Chen Pingan believed in good people being blessed with good karma, and this was a sincere and adamant belief. However, people couldn't place all of their hopes in the heavens alone. Living in this world and interacting with other people, each person could actually be viewed as a so-called heaven. In this sense, there was no need to always seek outside help and seek help from loftier entities. Many thoughts weigh on my mind as I observe the world, and it appears as if I'm not treating other people with enough sincerity. However, if I adhere to the rules and ultimately cause no harm to others with my actions, perhaps even bring a certain degree of benefits to the world, then I shouldn't constrain myself due to self-doubt. I can examine my conscience after my actions, slowly tempering my heart against my conscience. This is a process of cultivating the heart. This is what my master, the scholarly sage, suggested by telling me to think more about all kinds of different matters. Even if I discover afterward that my thoughts and actions were simply traveling in circles and returning to the same spot, this is still a top-notch cultivation method. I ask nothing from heaven and earth, yet heaven and earth gains a person who seeks to do good, a person who can protect himself and also benefit other people. Is this not delightful? Is this not good? The singularity of heaven and earth was eternally unchanging. with only the human heart forever shifting. The philosophies of the three teachings and the 100 schools of thought were fundamentally looking at this notion and striving to influence the human heart. After finishing the business discussions, they were once again just friends enjoying a drink with each other. Chan Sancho revealed a rumor, saying that another sword immortal from the northern complete reed continent was going to arrive at the Sword Chi Great Wall very soon. In fact, this sword immortal had seemingly arrived at Stalactite Mountain already. However, some sword immortals at the Sword Chi Great Wall were also going to return home soon. This was often the case for sword cultivators from the northern complete reed continent. They would usually return home after participating in one large-scale battle. However, 2 large-scale battles breaking out within a time span of 10 years had caught everyone off guard. As such, the large majority of sword cultivators from the northern complete reed continent had chosen to stay behind at the Sword Chi Great Wall, deciding to take part in another battle. There were naturally some sword immortals and earth immortal sword cultivators who had to leave the Sword Chi Great Wall for various reasons, given that they needed to deal with matters at their own sections. The Sword Chi Great Wall never uttered any nonsense regarding these decisions, and not only that, but there was even an unwritten rule that pertained to these outsider sword immortals as they prepared to leave. The local sword immortals, who were well acquainted with these outsider sword immortals, needed to treat the latter to some wine and bid them farewell. This could be viewed as a gift of gratitude from the Sword Chi Great Wall. Chen Pingan and Ning Yao turned around and looked toward the street in unison. 6 people were walking over, all of them sword immortals. Not only did Chen Pingan recognize one of the female sword immortals, but he was even quite familiar with her. She was none other than Li Kai, the sect leader of the northern complete reed continent's Duckweed Sword Lake. She had once said that she would come to the Sword Chi Great Wall after challenging the newly advanced sword immortal Lu Jinglong to a sword duel. Apart from fulfilling her promise to Li Yu, her good friend from Profound Dawn Mountain, she also needed to kill an additional great demon to commemorate Li Yu, who had already passed away after failing to break through to the next cultivation tier. Chen Pingan only recognized one of the 5 remaining people, the tall and sturdy elder with white hair and a white beard walking at the front of the group. This old man genuinely had a bad temper, and this was something Chen Pingan had personally witnessed and heard when he had stood atop the city wall in the past. The old man had directly uttered the old great sword immortal's name, loudly questioning Chen Qingdu's decision to kill Dong Guanpu. Afterward, the clan leader of the Dong clan had almost clashed physically with Chen Qingdu, eventually exclaiming, "Others are all afraid of you, Chen Qingdu, but I'm not afraid." This left a deep impression on Chen Pingan, and he also became slightly curious about Dong Guanpu, the person whom the old great sword immortal had killed with a single sword strike. This was because, according to Ning Yao's explanation, Dong Guanpu, or Grandpa Little Dong, was actually a very good person. He could only attribute this to every clan having its own burden to bear. There were far too many extraordinary sword immortals at the Sword Chi Great Wall, but there was even more unrest to worry about. Dong Sanging Li Kai, who had just arrived at the Sword Chi Great Wall, and the other sword immortals were seemingly making their way straight to the small wine shop. Seeing this, Chen Pingan stole an extra glance at the 4 other sword immortals, managing to guess the identities of 2 of them. There was sect leader Han Huizi of the Great Emblem Sword Sect and Huang Tong, the disciplinary elder of the Ancestral Hall. Chen Pingan and his companions had already stood up. After greeting his old ancestor, Dong Huafu said, "This wine shop doesn't sell wine on credit." Dong Seng shot a glare at him and asked, "Don't you have money on you?" "I never pay for my wine," Dong Huafu replied with a shake of his head. Dong Seng laughed heartily and remarked, "As expected of a descendant of my Dong clan. Looking across the entire Sword Chi Great Wall, only sons from the Dong clan can act so shamelessly, yet appear so reasonable." Daizhong inevitably felt uneasy and fearful. After all, this old man was Dong Seng, the clan leader of the Dong clan. He was the old sword immortal who had inscribed the character Dong onto the Great Wall. In the past, Aoyang had hated nothing more than sword technique sparring sessions with Dong Seng, avoiding this whenever he could. If he couldn't avoid it, then he would ask Dong Seng to give him money. If Dong Seng refused, then Aoyang would obediently stand beside the thatched cottage on the city wall and accept a beating. If he didn't go to the city wall to disturb Chen Qingdu's rest, then he would instead lie down on the rooftop of the Dong clan's ancestral hall, Dong Sanging waved a hand and put 2 tables together, saying to the youths, "Don't come over here to speak nonsense. Just focus on serving wine." Chen Pingan nodded in acknowledgement at Li Kai, who also smiled and nodded in response. Old ancestor Huang Tong of the Great Emblem Sword sect unexpectedly smiled at Chen Pingan, leaving him with no option but to cup his fists and bow in respect. However, he didn't say anything to the sword immortal. After sitting down, Dong Sanging glanced at the couplets and horizontal scroll plastered around the shop door, clicking his tongue in wonder and remarking, "How truly daring." Thankfully, the characters are written quite well, much better than Aoyang's worm-like characters. Beads of sweat involuntarily formed on Daizhang's forehead. Chun Sancho and Yen Zhuo also felt a little anxious. This couldn't be helped. They were too insignificant to even be scolded by Dong Sanging, whereas most of the Sword Immortal seniors in their clan had suffered genuine beatings at the hands of Dong Sanging. Perhaps only Ning Yao and Chen Pingan could be regarded as calm and composed at this moment. Dong Sanging stood up and left after drinking a pot of wine, and the 2 other local Sword Immortals from the Sword Qi Great Wall also bade farewell and left. Meanwhile, Han Huizi, Huang Tong, and Li Kai, the 3 Sword Immortals from the Northern Complete Reed continent, all stayed behind. Chen Pingan told Daizhang to retrieve an extra pot of fine wine from the shop, following which he accepted it and brought it to the table himself, saying, "Junior Chen Pingan pays his respects to Sect Leader Han, Sect Leader Li, and Sword Immortal Huang." Li Kai smiled widely and commented, "Did you hear that, Huang Tong? My name came before yours. This is the consequence of you not becoming a sect leader." Chen Pingan felt a little exasperated upon hearing this. Sword Immortal Li Kai was completely going against the justice and morality of the martial world. Unexpectedly, however, Huang Tong smiled and said, "I'm doing very well behind Sect Leader Li. In fact, being on top or under Sect Leader Li will also be okay." Chen Pingan had just sat down, yet he almost fell off his chair after hearing this. He didn't have time to worry about etiquette anymore, and he hurriedly drank some wine to suppress his shock. When traveling across the Northern Complete Reed continent before, he had never heard about this Sword Immortal from the Great Emblem Sword sect being such a direct and unrestrained person. Why hadn't Qi Jinglong mentioned this at all? To avoid disrespecting his lofty seniors? Li Kai chuckled coldly and responded, "Here's wishing you misfortune when you travel on the intercontinental ship, drowning halfway and becoming fish feed." Huang Tong laughed loudly, not appearing angry and instead looking quite delighted. Han Huizi was a very composed and mature person, possessing the demeanor of a lofty Sword Immortal. He smiled faintly at Chen Pingan and said, "You can ignore their nonsense." Huang Tong retracted his smile, no longer appearing immature as he said, "Stalactite Mountain is keeping an extremely close eye on the origins, destinations, and contents of every single messenger flying sword in the area now. In fact, Stalactite Mountain has unilaterally locked up a large number of messenger flying swords, and there's no way to speak reason with them." Thankfully, Qi Jinglong wrote his letter in a very smart manner, preventing his messenger flying sword from being blocked and taken. Since Chen Pingan is good friends with Lu Jinglong, and seeing that Li Kai is also a sword cultivator from the Northern Complete Reed continent, the 4 of us can all be regarded as one big family. Firstly, I need to thank Li Kai for being the first to challenge Qi Jinglong, helping him get off to a good start. That person who has a good relationship with the Confucian Academy came immediately afterward, forcing the old geezer, Bai Shang, to act shamelessly. It was thanks to this that Qi Jinglong was not only able to solidify his position as a Sword Immortal in the Northern Complete Reed continent, but he was even able to improve his sword Dao through the 3 consecutive battles. The Great Emblem Sword sect owes Li Kai a huge favor regarding this. After saying this, Huang Tong smiled faintly and continued, "So Sect Leader Li can feel free to choose the front or the back. I won't say a single word, and I won't be a man if I so much as frown." Li Kai pursed her lips and said, "I have some good news for you. Jiang Shangzhen has already advanced to the immortal tier. I'm a mighty Sword Immortal, and this is already enough. So what if I'm not man enough?" Huang Tong immediately said, that godforsaken Jiang Shangzhen was like a shared nightmare for the cultivators of the Northern Complete Reed continent. He was already able to use his golden core as a nascent soul in the past, and he was renowned for being able to unleash the power of an immortal tier cultivator as an unpolished jade tier cultivator afterward. So, what could he achieve now that he had advanced to the immortal tier? Disregarding Zhang Shangzhen's cultivation, who wanted to interact with a person who was metaphorically running around with a bucket of shit. Throwing a punch or launching a sword strike at Zhang Shangzhen would genuinely grant them piss and shit in return. Most importantly, Zhang Shangzhen liked to bear grudges and was also very good at running away. Thus, even Huang Tong wasn't willing to provoke him. In the past, an elderly nascent tier cultivator from the northern complete reed continent hadn't believed these facts about Zhang Shangzhen, going as far as to spend 20 years of his life trying to hunt down and kill him, determined to exterminate this vermin that everyone wanted dead, but no one was able to kill. However, he failed to make many inroads, and his immortal force was subject to great misery. Zhang Shangzhen had fabricated a mountain of stories about the chaotic, romantic and hostile relationships of the immortal force, managing to compile them into several large books and even including pictures. Not only that, but Zhang Shangzhen even gave these books away for free, sometimes even paying people to accept them. And once people accepted these books, they would at least read a few pages, no? Han Huizi smiled and said, "Senior brother, there's a junior present, so even if you don't care about your own image, you should at least look after Jinglong's image, right?" Huang Tong cleared his throat and drank a sip of wine, continuing, "Let's discuss some proper matters, Li Kai. The customs and traditions at the Sword Qi Great Wall appear similar to those of the northern complete reed continent, but in reality the difference is actually quite big. Indeed, the deadly clashes on the battlefield to the south of the city wall couldn't be more different than the one-on-one duels we're familiar with. Many cultivators from other continents are prone to dying during the first few days of battle, suffering death if they're careless for even a second. People shouldn't become conceited because of their status as an unpolished jade tier sword cultivator or whatnot, what with the battlefield being a place of deadly tricks and schemes. The demon tribe also has some incredibly sly and cunning members." Huang Tong flicked his wrist and retrieved 3 books from his minimization treasure, 2 old and 1 new. He pushed them toward Li Kai, who was sitting opposite him, and said, "These 2 books were printed in the Sword Qi Great Wall, with one introducing the demon tribe and one being similar to a military book. I wrote these books from personal experience after being involved in 2 large-scale battles. I suggest that you familiarize yourself with these 3 books and memorize them, or else I'll honor you with a cup of wine right now. That way, I won't need to raise a cup in your honor when I return to the northern complete reed continent's great emblem sword sect in the future, and hear about Li Kai dying in battle. After all, that would be a case of you seeking death, so it absolutely wouldn't be deserving of me drawing my sword to pay homage." Li Kai accepted the 3 books and nodded in response, replying, "This is a matter of life and death, so I wouldn't dare to be conceited and careless." Huang Tong sighed and looked at his junior brother, the sect leader of the Great Emblem Sword sect, saying, "Miss Li had no option but to personally travel here due to having no other capable cultivators in her sect. However, the Great Emblem Sword sect still has me, Huang Tong, to represent the sect, no? Junior brother, I'm not good at dealing with miscellaneous matters, and you're also aware that it would be better for you to return to the northern complete reed continent to further help Jinglong ascend even higher. It's not like there won't be any representatives of the Great Emblem Sword sect at the Sword Qi Great Wall after you leave. There's still me." Han Huizi shook his head and said, "We already reached an agreement before. There's no use trying to change my mind." "Agreement my ass." Huang Tong fumed. "I'm only pissing off back to the northern complete reed continent because I can't defeat you in battle. You can practice sword techniques in earnest when you return to the Great Emblem Sword sect," Han Huizi said in a calm voice. Huang Tong felt extremely anxious as he drank a large bowl of wine and said, "But you're ultimately the leader of a sect. Our Great Emblem Sword sect can maintain a clear conscience, even if you leave and I remain." "I'll suffer a guilty conscience," Han Huizi replied. "Ever since its founding, not a single sect leader of the Great Emblem Sword sect has battled to death at the Sword Qi Great Wall, nor has a single Ascension tier sword immortal. We can potentially achieve the latter with Lu Jinglong's talent, so I can feel at ease and complete the former first." Huang Tong cut a dejected figure as he left. However, he visited the wine shop before he left for Stalactite Mountain, using a wisp of sword qi to inscribe his name on a wooden tablet and writing another sentence on the backside. "The old man leaves in desolation, devoid of a sword immortal spirit." Li Kai was filled with spirit and vigor after hearing about the wine shop's rules, but she only inscribed her name on the so-called safety tablet and didn't inscribe anything on the backside. She said she would return and inscribe the backside after she killed 2 upper 5-tier demons. Han Huizi inscribed both his name and a message. Han Huizi, 4th sect leader of the Great Emblem Sword sect. I have no major regrets in this life. Chen Pingan quietly drank wine by himself during this time. Only when Li Kai and Han Huizi, 2 sect leaders from the northern complete reed continent, left together and walked along the deserted street at night did Chen Pingan stand up and call out, "Sect leaders, don't look back," Han Huizi said with a soft chuckle. However, Li Kai had already turned around and asked, "Is something the matter?" "Wine money," Chen Pingan responded with a smile. Li Kai looked at Han Huizi in puzzlement, asking, "We need to pay for wine at the Sword Qi Great Wall?" "I don't know," Han Huizi replied with a relaxed expression. Li Kai frowned and said, "Feel free to keep the tab under Jiang Shangzhen's name. You can record 1 snowflake coin as 1 lesser heat coin." Chen Pingan smiled and nodded in response. The 2 sword immortals slowly walked along the street. Li Kai found this slightly strange. With Chen Pingan's temperament, it didn't make sense for him to do something like this. Thinking of this, she turned around and looked back. The young man was holding his hands inside his opposite sleeves as he stood there and looked at them. Only when Li Kai looked back did he return to the wine table and sit down. Han Huizi used his mind's lake to chuckle and explain, "This young man is just making conversation for the sake of it. He most likely thinks that even exchanging a few more words with us is a good thing." "What kind of interaction is this?" Li Kai asked in exasperation. Han Huizi thought for a moment before surprisingly giving an answer. "This is an interaction between sword cultivators." Compared to before, Chen Pingan was the only additional person at the Ning residence. It hadn't become that much livelier. The reason behind the Ning residence's somberness was far too solemn and heavy. Following Ning Yao's birth, the Ning residence initially had a chance to become a top-notch clan like the Dong, Qi, and Chang clans. Now, however, that was nothing more than a past glory. Yet, there also existed a dark haze that couldn't be shooed away. Elsewhere, business at Dai Zhang's wine shop had initially been on the verge of going downhill, but thanks to Sword Immortal Huang Tong from the Great Emblem Sword sect visiting his hometown to drink and Old Sword Immortal Dong Sang personally visiting the wine shop, as well as 4 other Sword Immortals visiting with them and 3 leaving inscriptions on the safety tablets, business immediately started to boom again. The wine shop was unbelievably busy, with a large number of people squatting on the ground to drink. At the same time, the wine shop promoted a new and unique pickled vegetable dish, giving it away for free whenever someone purchased a pot of wine. It was a perfect match with the slightly bland Bamboo Sea Small World wine, with the crunchy pickles a perfect complement for each sip of wine. Chen Pingan maintained a very disciplined schedule while he stayed at the Ning residence, and apart from refining qi for 12 hours at the pavilion on Dragon Slaying Cliff every single day, he would often spend 1 hour sweeping the courtyard in the morning with Grandma Bai. During this time, he would ask detailed questions about matters pertaining to fist techniques. Li Er had explained things clearly enough during Chen Pingan's training sessions at Lion Peak, but when it came to grandmasters at the peak, the fundamentals of their fist principles would generally be connected, but the paths they took afterward would be completely different. Grandma Bai would often give demonstrations when she got into the fine details, allowing Chen Pingan to emulate her movements. In fact, Grandma Bai felt especially happy and content because Chen Pingan had already used her fist stance during his battles on the street. Bai Lianshuang's fist techniques were completely different from most in the world, focusing most on retracting one's fist and containing one's intent. Only when one tempered one's fist intent to a state of fullness and flawlessness could one think about throwing punches at one's opponents. At noon every day, Chen Pingan would enter the training ground in the Minute Small World with Nailan Yeshing, spending approximately 1 hour to familiarize himself with the flying sword of an unpolished jade tier sword cultivator. There would be another training session at midnight, one that Nailan Yeshing had suggested, saying that the 4 hours at midnight would be the best time to learn his 2 completely different sword intent essences. Learning sword techniques from Nailan Yeshing was completely different from learning fist techniques from Grandma Bai, with Chen Pingan often suffering injuries in the process. Nailan Yeshing already controlled his sword strikes very well, and Chen Pingan would only appear like he was bloodied and riddled with wounds. In reality, however, these were nothing more than minor cuts. Even so, Grandma Bai would feel pained and worried every time she saw this. Chen Pingan had suffered slightly heavier wounds one time, and when drinking wine with Nailan Yeshing after the training session, as they always did, Grandma Bai had severely scolded Nailan Yeshing, unleashing a torrent of abuse at him. Nailan Yeshing hadn't dared to talk back, and he could only sit there and hold on to his wine cup. Chen Pingan had already explained the situation to Grandma Bai, as had Ning Yao, with both of them telling Grandma Bai that she didn't need to worry. For some unknown reason, however, the knowledgeable and capable old woman was quite stubborn and unreasonable regarding this matter, leading to pain and suffering for Nailan Yeshing. After hearing that Chen Pingan's barrier for the 18 stops technique was loosening and showing signs of breakthrough, Grandma Bai finally suppressed her worry and let Nailan Yeshing off the hook. He needed to be given credit for his hard work, even if he wasn't given credit for his achievements. Regarding the 18 stops technique that Aoyang had modified, Chen Pingan privately asked Ning Yao why Aoyang had only taught it to so few people. Ning Yao's expression became solemn as she explained that it wasn't the case that Aoyang didn't want to teach the modified 18 stops technique to more people, but rather, he didn't dare to. Sitting inside the pavilion, Chen Pingan suddenly jolted awake at this realization, so terrified that he surprisingly broke into a cold sweat. If Aoyang had taught this modified technique to too many people, then it was inevitable that the younger generation of demon tribe sword cultivators in the savage world would manage to elevate their sword Dao to the next level. Ning Yao looked at Chen Pingan. "I've only taught the technique to a single person, Pei Qian," Chen Pingan said. "Then it's okay," Ning Yao replied with a nod. Afterward, Chen Pingan asked whether, with the exception of the 2 published books, there were any other books by sword immortals available in the markets. It didn't matter whether the sword immortal was local or not, nor did it matter whether the book was about battles at the Sword Qi Great Wall or travels through the savage world. Ning Yao replied that the Ning residence didn't have many such books in its collection, with most of the books in the scripture library belonging to the 3 teachings and the 100 schools of thought. However, Chen Pingan could try his luck at Mirage Market located in the north of the city. Chen Pingan became quite hesitant. This market was extremely strange, with its foundation genuinely being a mirage. Moreover, this mirage had remained tangible and condensed for a long time, not dispersing into thin air. The buildings were majestic and imposing, appearing much like immortal residences, and the 40 or so structures of various styles could hold several thousand people at once. The Sword Qi Great Wall was tightly guarded, making it difficult for outsiders to enter and exit. Thus, the large businesses that had frequent dealings between the majestic world and the Sword Qi Great Wall would all set up shop at Mirage Market, selling all kinds of strange and wonderful artifacts, ancient curios, immortal treasures, and everything in between. However, Mirage Market would fade once every 100 years, during which the cultivators and people residing there would need to exit and wait for the market to condense into a tangible form again. Only then could they return. Ning Yao had once faced an assassination attempt at Mirage Market. It was also over there that Grandma Bai had fallen from the 10th tier of martial arts to the 9th tier, the mountain summit tier. One had to realize that, unlike Qi refiners, it was quite rare for pure martial artists to drop cultivation bases. From this, it was abundantly clear just how dangerous and brutal the assassination attempt on Ning Yao had been. Chen Pingan didn't agree with Ning Yao's suggestion to visit Mirage Market together, and he instead planned to ask someone to help him purchase the books. This was simply a matter of spending money that he had worked hard to earn and spend. Disregarding their combat power and only focusing on their cultivation speed, Chen Pingan could compare himself to Dai Zhang, Chen Sanxiu, and the others even if he didn't compare himself to Ning Yao. Even so, Chen Pingan still sincerely felt like he wasn't at their level. One time at the training ground, Yin Zhua had joked that he would teach in the stead of Chen Pingan, passing down the unparalleled fist technique to Guizhujiu. Chen Pingan had squatted down nearby and ignored their nonsense. However, when he looked up and glanced at the sight of Chen Sanxiu and Dong Huafu refining qi in the pavilion, using their bridges of immortality to form links with heaven and earth, he saw that their speed of channeling spiritual energy was even quicker than the eye could follow. This caused Chen Pingan to feel slightly vexed, feeling like he was wasting the top-notch environment of dragon-slaying cliff by cultivating there every day. Ning Yao stood beside Chen Pingan and consoled, "Your bridge of immortality isn't fully constructed yet, and the 2 of them are already golden core tier cultivators. So that's why you feel like there exists such a huge gulf. Things will be different when you obtain all 5 bonded items of the 5 elements, with each bonded item supporting the others. You only have 3 bonded items right now, but the quality of the water seal, the soil of the eastern treasured vile continent's 5 mountains, and the wooden divine statue are all good enough, able to form the shell of a small world. You have to realize that even here at the Sword Chi Great Wall, the large majority of Earth immortal sword cultivators don't possess such complicated core abodes. Chen Pingan smiled and remarked, "It's enough for sword cultivators to have a decently good bonded sword. It doesn't need to be supported by so many bonded items." "Aren't I just trying to comfort you?" Ning Yao asked. "I appreciate it," Chen Pingan replied with a smile. He then recalled something and asked, "Dai Zhang is busy with her store and wine shop every day. Will this truly not affect her cultivation?" Ning Yao shook her head and replied, "No, it won't. Apart from when she advanced to the abode tier and the golden core tier at the Ning residence, she has relied on herself for all of her other breakthroughs. She can advance very quickly each time she hones herself on the battlefield, and she's a cultivation prodigy who's naturally built for large-scale battles. You didn't see her full sparring session with Dong Huafu last time, but you'll understand what I mean when you fight alongside her on the battlefield in the future. You'll understand why Chen Sanqiu and the others treat her as a friend until death. Every time a large-scale battle concludes, Chen Sanqiu will ask Fatty Yen and Dong Huafu whether they saw the back of Dai Zhang's head or not, and whether it's beautiful or not." Ning Yao paused for a moment before continuing. "Because of this, the seniors in the Dong clan and the Chen clan have always been thoroughly impressed by Dai Zhang, who doesn't hail from a very good background. This is especially so for the Chen clan, which even intends to have a young prodigy get married to Dai Zhang." Chen Sanqiu's older brother agreed to this suggestion, but Dai Zhang herself didn't agree to it. Grandpa Dong's willingness to see the great emblem sword sex sword immortal Huang Tong off at Dai Zhang's shop had nothing to do with you, but it had everything to do with Dai Zhang saving Dong Huafu's life in the past. Dai Zhang once said, "There's no need to save me if my death is inevitable," and this was a statement greatly appreciated by Grandpa Dong. Ning Yao smiled and said, "I didn't discuss these matters in much detail with Dai Zhang, seeing that she always likes to overthink things. I'm afraid that she'll end up getting distracted. She holds far too much admiration for those senior sword immortals with outstanding military merit, so much so that it's become a detriment. You would have most likely noticed the situation at the wine shop just then. Regardless of whether it was Zui Yu, Grandpa Dong, Han Huizi, Li Kai, or the others, Dai Zhang would feel extremely tense and nervous whenever she saw any of them." Chen Pingan nodded and replied, "I did notice this. If you're okay with it, I can chat with her about this matter later. I have some experience regarding these things." Ning Yao glared at Chen Pingan and asked, "Why would I not be okay with this? Perhaps you view me as a cold-hearted person." Chen Pingan reached forward and pinched Ning Yao's cheeks, replying, "Of course not." Fatty Yen had his eyes peeled and his ears open the entire time, and in a moment of carelessness, he was kicked in the face by the young girl who was learning martial arts from him. Yanzhuo was completely unfazed, and he used his eyes to signal to Guozhuzhou, who turned around and immediately drew a sharp breath. Her master was truly courageous. Sure enough, those who were capable would become more courageous. At the same time, she was also incredibly smart and fortunate, having found herself such a brilliant master. She was definitely going to benefit from this. Ning Yao stood still and didn't move, allowing Chen Pingan to pinch her cheeks as she remarked, "How very capable of you. Why don't I accompany you for a sparring session in the Minute Small World?" Chen Pingan hurriedly retracted his hands, clasping one hand behind his back and gesturing toward the training ground with his other hand as he replied with a faint smile, "After you." Ning Yao raised an eyebrow and dashed into the Minute Small World located near the south of the training ground, gracefully coming to a stop before lightly flexing her wrists. However, Chen Pingan had already fled into the distance, disappearing without a trace. Ning Yao didn't chase after him, instead summoning her flying sword and casually strolling around the Minute Small World. This couldn't be regarded as practicing sword techniques, and she was simply giving her flying sword some fresh air, having not summoned it for a long time. Cultivation was truly not worth a mention for Ning Yao. Guozhuzhou appeared slightly dazed as she praised, assessing the situation and knowing when to advance and when to yield. "My master is truly a man of greatness. Lu Duan, I'll teach you fist techniques, and you can teach me the art of flattery. How does that sound? Yanjue asked. Copying her master's pose from when he had stood on the street and faced his opponents before, the young girl clasped one hand behind her back and clenched her other hand into a fist, appearing confident and at ease as she shook her head and replied, "Your heart isn't sincere and your talent is even worse." Yanjue was slightly dumbfounded. Ningyao beckoned with her hand and said, "Lu Duan, come here for a beating." "Alrighty," Guizhuzhou shouted in reply. She then turned around to flee, and soaring through the sky wasn't a difficult task given that she was already a middle 5-tier sword cultivator. However, her escape wasn't as smooth as her master's. This didn't matter, and a disciple didn't need to worry about being inferior to their master. However, it was a shame that Ningyao reached forward and made a grabbing motion, using a perfectly weighted wisp of sword qi to wrap around Guizhuzhou and casually drag her back. Guizhuzhou stumbled and stood still, giving a soft shout before putting her hands together and interlocking her fingers, exclaiming, "Heed my call, heaven and earth, make me invisible to big sister Ning, and make her punches and kicks not hurt at all." Yanjue cupped his face and started to violently massage it, muttering to himself, "I would rather become Lu Duan's disciple than to take her as my disciple." Guizhuzhou was severely underestimating Ningyao, if she felt like her prayers would help her escape punishment. The young girl's face was black and blue as she skipped out of the Ning residence, and before leaving, she even asked big sister Ning whether she wanted to eat some desserts. At the same time, she patted her chest and promised that she had simply face-planted due to walking too carelessly. However, big sister Ning mysteriously grabbed her head and thumped it against the door several times. The slightly dizzy Guizhuzhou left the holy land of fist technique training by herself, touching her face as she pitifully walked along the street. Blood from her nose covered her palm, but she casually wiped the blood onto her clothes. She then slowly walked forward with her head held high, thinking to herself that learning fist techniques truly wasn't easy. However, this was a good thing. After all, what kind of peerless fist technique could be learned so easily? When she achieved 70 to 80% mastery of the fist technique, she wouldn't do anything to big sister Ning. She was master's wife, so master wouldn't necessarily be willing to side with his disciple. Guizhuzhou would tolerate her behavior. However, Dongbyud, the old girl who couldn't find herself a partner, would need to be careful when she walked around at night in the future. The young girl, who had a lush green inkstone hanging by her waist, gazed up at the clear blue sky, nodding lightly to herself and thinking that today was a good day. Chen Pingan and Ningyao went for a walk to Daizheng's wine shop. In the past, they would each have their own rest time between qi refinement, and these rest times wouldn't necessarily line up. Thus, it was often Chen Pingan who went to the wine shop by himself. It was clear that Ningyao had purposely cut her cultivation short today so that she could accompany Chen Pingan. Chen Pingan didn't think much about this. When walking past the wine shops that were nowhere near as popular as his own, Chen Pingan looked at the many couplets and horizontal scrolls and said to Ningyao in a soft voice, "Their calligraphy skills aren't as good as mine, and even the contents of their couplets and horizontal scrolls are nowhere near as good as mine, don't you think?" One of the big restaurants recruited an unofficial disciple of a Confucian sage, the sage of an academy, to personally write their couplet and horizontal scroll. Ningyao replied. Chen Pingan smiled and said, "They've only taken a small and shallow leaf out of my book, so this won't do them any good. I dare wager that the restaurant owner will need to offer incense and thank the heavens if business at his restaurant doesn't become worse. He doesn't need to dream about the wine drinkers appreciating the couplet and horizontal scroll. There are 70-odd restaurants and wine shops competing here, and there are 100 or so types of immortal wine produced in the majestic world, so it isn't difficult at all to find wine to drink. At the end of the day, however, what is actually being sold?" "What?" Ningyao asked. Chen Pingan smiled and didn't say anything, continuing to take in the contents of the couplets and horizontal scrolls that were like shy young ladies. "You can piss off if you don't want to say," Ningyao snapped. "We, of course, want the customers who drink our wine to feel like sword immortals even if they aren't sword immortals," Chen Pingan hurriedly explained. "If they're already sword immortals, then we want them to feel even greater than sword immortals. Our wine shop is small, and the tables and chairs are crude, yet it's unexpectedly unrestrained, with the small wine cups containing colossal worlds. Which is why Dai Zhang's suggestion of copying those big and fancy restaurants and swapping out our current tables and chairs now that we've made some money is completely unacceptable. Fatty Yen suggested using his own money to make an investment, offering up a large silk shop that's under his name but isn't doing too well. However, I directly turned down his offer. Firstly, moving locations will damage the feng shui of the wine shop, stripping away the unique atmosphere and charm of our current wine shop for nothing in return. Secondly, this city isn't small with tens of thousands of people living here, and we can estimate that half of the population is female. That being the case, will silk and satin truly not sell? So, I plan to have a good chat with Fatty Yen, and I'll tell him not to invest in our wine shop. Rather, we'll invest in his silk shop. Casting our gaze across the city, which group is genuinely willing to spend money apart from sword cultivators who like to drink? It's naturally women who like to make themselves more beautiful. With this in mind, I've already drafted up a new couplet for the silk shop. Young once said that men practicing sword techniques can rely on just their talent to become sword immortals, Ningyao said slowly. However, a person can't dream about becoming a kind and considerate man like him if they haven't been pierced in the heart by the incisive words of women that are like flying swords, suffered the emotional pain of women walking away and not looking back, and had to drink hundreds upon thousands of liters of lingering dream wine. Chen Pingan turned around to face Ningyao, winking and saying, "You're right about that. For the past 10 years, the person on my mind has been extremely far away, so far away that even the flying swords of immortals can barely reach her. I could only drink wine and practice fist techniques to wash away my worries." He suddenly became panicked and flustered in the next moment. Ningyao didn't conceal anything as her expression turned into one of despondence. It was as if her eyes wanted to convey something, but she couldn't help but hesitate. She wasn't good at speaking, so she always chose to remain silent. This was because she didn't know how to speak in a romantic manner. In the past, the young boy wearing straw sandals, who had only arrived at Stalactite Mountain after throwing 1,000,000 punches, had been just as awkward as her when it came to speaking to others. As such, she didn't feel bad about anything, and she felt like this was only natural. Everything was communicated silently between the two of them. Chen Pingan extended a thumb and gently brushed it across Ningyao's eyebrow, saying in a soft voice, "Don't be unhappy. You need to relax your frown." "I'm not unhappy," Ningyao replied. Chen Pingan bent down and lifted Ningyao up before sprinting away. Ningyao was at a complete loss. Carrying Ningyao in his arms, Chen Pingan ran all the way to Dai Zhang's wine shop. The several dozen customers sitting at the tables and squatting on the ground were all stupefied by what they saw. There were quite a number of young women at the wine shop, most of them from large clans and visiting the wine shop due to its fame. They weren't shocked by this sight, and their eyes instead lit up. In fact, some of the bolder women even drank a large swig of wine and whistled loudly and adeptly. Chen Pingan put Ningyao down and waved an arm, announcing, "Those who haven't paid yet will all get 10% off." He then added, "The words of the second shopkeeper might not count, so everything will be subject to shopkeeper Dai Zhang's final approval." The customers immediately turned their heads toward Dai Zhang, who smiled and said with a nod, "Let's give everyone 10% off." Cheers and claps instantly rang out around the wine shop. Bloody hell. Being able to get a discount from this second shopkeeper truly wasn't an easy feat. Chen Pingan grabbed a small stool and was just about to go to the intersection between the street and the alley to become a storyteller again. He looked at Ningyao, who nodded to give her approval. Dai Zhang walked over to Ningyao's side and asked in a quiet voice, "What's going on today?" Chen Pingan never acted like this in the past, and judging by his behavior, it won't be long before he starts beating drums and gongs on the street. Ningyao shot a sideways glance at a table of young women in the distance who were engaged in spirited chatter, smiling and not saying anything. Dai Zhang suppressed a smile. She had once secretly mentioned to Ningyao that females would often visit the wine shop to drink now, yet their purpose for patronizing the shop wasn't for the wine. Instead, they were naturally visiting because of the renowned second shopkeeper. There were two shameless customers who had not only purchased wine, but had also inscribed their names and messages on the safety tablets hanging around the walls. If Dai Zhang weren't the shopkeeper, she would have felt a strong urge to remove these safety tablets. Ningyao had also flipped the two safety tablets around to read their messages before, and she had quietly flipped them back after taking a quick glance. Chen Pingan sat down on the small stool, and he was surrounded by a large group of children in no time. He continued to tell a fantasy story about gods and ghosts that he hadn't completed last time, and just like before, he finished off at a critical cliffhanger, smiling widely as he told the children to come again next time. The children grumbled in complaint. The young boy who had wanted to learn fist techniques from Chen Pingan even earlier than Guizhuzhou squatted beside Chen Pingan's feet and retrieved a copper coin from a ceramic pot, saying, "Keep going, Chen Pingan, I'll give you a tip. I can give you more if this isn't enough." Chen Pingan reached over and pushed the little boy's head away. Scram! He then retrieved a rubbing from his pocket, gently shaking it open and asking the children, "Are there any characters here that you don't recognize? Are there any characters you want to learn? There are heaps of characters that I don't recognize. What's the point of learning this?" A young boy replied in unhappiness, "This is boring as heck, and I don't want to listen. Continue telling the story or I'm going to leave." Chen Pingan looked around, and it was much the same attitude from the other children. These children who had grown up in poor families were indeed uninterested in learning characters. It was difficult to keep them engaged once the initial interest wore off. Learning how to read wasn't useless at the Sword Chi Great Wall, and it was naturally very useful for those who were fortunate enough to become sword cultivators. For the impoverished families living in the streets and alleys over here, however, learning how to read was merely a way to stave off boredom. If it weren't for wanting to know what those illustrated characters in the novels were saying, the children would actually be fine with never learning how to read and never interacting with the characters on those stone tablets. Chen Pingan smiled and replied, "There's no rush. I'll only explain a single character today, and I'll continue to tell the story after I'm done." Chen Pingan picked up the bamboo branch on his knee and wrote a single character on the ground. "Steady. Who recognizes this character?" he asked with a smile. Someone responded by reading the character aloud. Chen Pingan then raised the verdant green bamboo branch that was vaguely surrounded by spiritual energy as he continued, "I'll give this bamboo branch to whoever can help me explain this character today. Of course, the explanation must be good. For example, you need to at least tell me why the character steady includes the character urgent, even though it implies not quick. One, is this not a conflict? Perhaps the sages fell asleep when they were creating characters back then, so they were muddle-headed as they randomly created this character for us." The large group of children exchanged blank looks with each other. Being able to recognize this character as steady was already very impressive, so who would understand all these further complexities? A young girl who was stealthily hiding among the group of children said in a quiet voice, "I can explain the meaning, future master." Chen Pingan shook his head and replied with a smile, "No, you've attended school from a young age, so it will be unfair to the others if I allow you to explain this character." Guizhuzhou was very interested in her master's bamboo branch. If she obtained it, just how magnificent and imposing would she appear when she returned to the streets near her home? The young girl was slightly annoyed as she exclaimed, "I wouldn't have attended school if I knew this." Whether purposely or subconsciously, the other children all stepped back and distanced themselves from Guizhuzhou when they noticed her. This wasn't purely because of fear and envy, and there was also a hint of inferiority, as well as the closely attached sense of pride. The young girl didn't think anything about this, and as she squatted alone on the ground, she didn't care about the small inkstone by her waist resting on the unpaved ground either. An impoverished young boy with bright eyes and slender eyebrows, who was wearing patched clothes, mustered his courage and pointed at the character written on the ground in front of Chen Pingan, his face slightly red and his voice quivering as he said quietly, "The character steady is composed of the grain radical and the character urgent. Grains actually grow very quickly, yet they also grow slowly at the same time. There's a small stone tablet on Spirit Rhino Alley where my house is located, and the inscriptions on this stone tablet read, 'Rice husks and chaff gathered together, wealth comparable to emperors and nobles.'" I asked Big Sister Daizhong about this, and she understood the meaning of this inscription. However, Big Sister Daizhong said she's never actually seen husks or chaff either. I feel like the character steady is fundamentally characterized by grain, but outwardly characterized by the character urgent. This is similar to the wine shop opened by you and Big Sister Daizhong. You're making money quickly, but you're spending money slowly, allowing you to accumulate wealth. That way, Big Sister Daizhong can buy a bigger house in the future. Chen Pingan had kept an eye on this young boy for a long time, seeing that he was one of the children who paid the most attention when listening to stories and learning new characters. He was also an apprentice who had been involved in repairing the broken street. However, Chen Pingan discovered that this young boy possessed a frail physique, not only letting slip the optimal time to practice fist techniques, but also being relatively unsuited to practicing martial arts. His situation was also slightly different from that of Zhao Shuxia. It wasn't that he couldn't practice fist techniques, but it would be very difficult for him to advance. Indeed, he wouldn't be able to overcome the painful barrier of the third tier. Chen Pingan hadn't been willing to give up, but after asking Ningyao, she had also shaken her head after glancing at the young boy from a distance, saying that he didn't possess the aptitude for learning sword techniques. He couldn't complete the first step, and as a result, becoming a sword cultivator would be impossible. There was no way to brute force this. Only after hearing this did Chen Pingan give up. Perhaps it wasn't the case that the young boy genuinely liked to learn new characters, but having grown up in poverty and with nothing to do, he needed to find a way to entertain himself without spending any money. Perhaps the impoverished young boy liked to focus on activities that were free, and could slightly differentiate him from the other children. Chen Pingan smiled and said with a nod, "Your explanation of the character is half correct, Zhang Jiazhen, so I'll give this bamboo branch to you." He offered the bamboo branch to Zhang Jiazhen, but the young boy, who was surprised about Chen Pingan actually knowing his name, flushed beet red and vigorously shook his head in a flustered manner, replying, "I don't want this." Chen Pingan retracted the bamboo branch and asked with a smile, "What's wrong? Perhaps you want to learn fist techniques." Zhang Jiazhen shook his head and replied, "That will affect my work." Chen Pingan smiled and said, "Possessing a specialized skill is the most important foundation for a person, or else it's very difficult to enjoy a good life. At that time, people will have all kinds of reasons to blame heaven and earth, feeling like they're being wronged even though they're a good person. That will be very frustrating indeed." The young boy vaguely understood this, but even though he recognized the most characters out of all the children in the nearby streets and alleys, could he truly understand those legitimate principles? Chen Pingan's words ultimately didn't reflect the principles and teachings of the sages, and they were instead the most basic teachings of the mortal families. As such, Zhang Jiazhen was somewhat able to understand Chen Pingan's remark. For example, Chen Pingan's approval of him working to make money and feed himself. This allowed the young boy to feel much more at ease. Receiving the approval of other people, no matter how minor, was no small matter for children like Zhang Jiazhen. "I don't want to become a bricklayer." The little boy carrying a ceramic pot hollered. "It's a lowly job, and it won't be possible to get a good-looking wife." Chen Pingan reached over and placed a hand on the little boy's head, gently pushing it around as he said, Yes, and you have the grandest ambitions out of everyone, okay? When you return home, remember to ask your dad whether your mom is beautiful, okay? If you possess the courage and dare to ask, then I'll tell you another story about gods and ghosts. Do we have a deal? Am I itching for a beating? You'll continue to tell stories, and they won't grow legs and run away. However, if my mom gets angry, then my dad will push me forward to take the beating," the little boy replied. He then raised the ceramic pot and huffed. "Chen Pingan, are you going to teach me fist techniques or not? Do you not want to earn money? Are you an idiot?" Chen Pingan smiled and said, "I'll teach a basic fist technique after I finish the rest of the story today. Everyone can learn, but let me say this first. This fist technique is very boring, and you definitely won't achieve anything great if you learn it. At most, you'll feel slightly less cold when it snows in winter." The little boy nodded in response, feeling like this outcome was acceptable. It would be a waste not to learn. And thus he embraced his ceramic pot tightly. Chen Pingan looked at the little boy and chuckled. "You're not going to give me your money pot? Chen Pingan, you're shameless enough to steal money from children," the little boy asked. "An elite like you is truly embarrassing. I'm not going to learn fist techniques from you, and I definitely won't become like you when I become an elite in the future." Laughter broke out around the small stool. Even the slightly older children like Zhang Jiazhen felt envious of this little boy's courage. What with his daring to speak to Chen Pingan like this? Chen Pingan finished off the story about ghosts causing troubles and cultivators vanquishing demons, after which he stood up and placed the bamboo branch on the small stool. The children shuffled aside to give him space, and they looked at the young man in azure slowly performing the 6-step walking meditation. Chen Pingan stood still and asked with a smile, "Did you all get that?" Guizhuzhou's eyes were firmly fixed on Chen Pingan. His fist technique was unparalleled, and he possessed the demeanor of a grandmaster. "Is that all?" the little boy carrying the ceramic pot asked in a dumbfounded voice. "Yeah," Chen Pingan replied with a nod. The little boy gently put the ceramic pot on the ground and stood up, baring his teeth as he swung his arms around. Panting and retracting his fists, the little boy fumed. "This is the fist technique you used to defeat those little sword immortals before. Who are you trying to trick, Chen Pingan? You're walking one step at a time as slowly as you can. Even I feel impatient for you." Chen Pingan pointed at the character on the ground and asked with a smile, "Have you forgotten already?" He then performed the 6-step walking meditation again, just as slowly as before. Unhurriedly throwing punches as he walked forward, he continued, "All fist techniques are rooted in the notion of steadiness, and when the fist techniques are eventually mastered one day, a single fist unleashed can." Chen Pingan stopped after completing the final step, with his fist moving diagonally upward and facing the sky. The children looked at the sky with their eyes wide open. Chen Pingan quietly retracted his fist, grabbed the bamboo branch and the small stool, and prepared to leave. "This punch didn't cause any boom?" the little boy asked in a daze. The other children nodded in agreement, feeling like this wasn't interesting at all. "I didn't throw an actual punch," Chen Pingan explained with a smile. The atmosphere became slightly awkward. Guizhuzhou took a deep breath before shouting, "Boom!" Chen Pingan placed a hand on his forehead. This was slightly embarrassing, but he couldn't hurt the feelings of the young girl. Thus, he went against his conscience and squeezed out a smile, raising a thumb at the young girl. The large group of children exchanged baffled looks with each other. This was very uninteresting, so it was time to disperse and go home. They were better off waiting for the next storytelling session. Chen Pingan called Zhang Jiazhen over, and the young boy was extremely puzzled and uneasy as he walked to Chen Pingan's side. In his eyes, the young man called Chen Pingan was a lofty person from the heavens. Chen Pingan slowly walked forward, flicking his wrist and silently retrieving a bamboo leaf. He pushed it into Zhang Jiazhen's hand and said in a quiet voice, "This is for you. You can carry it with you, and just like the fist stance, it's also not very useful. I'm not trying to purposely test you or anything, and I'm simply telling you the truth. However, as long as you're willing to learn fist techniques and can perform the fist stance a few times each day, then that and this small bamboo leaf can indeed help you against the biting cold. It's about to snow soon, and this will make things slightly easier when you work outside." Zhang Jiazhen held the bamboo leaf tightly, remaining silent for a moment before asking, "Do I truly not possess the talent to learn martial arts and sword techniques?" "That's correct," Chen Pingan replied with a nod. The rims of the young boy's eyes became red as he silently lowered his head. Chen Pingan looked straight ahead and commented, "Being able to feed yourself and look after yourself at such a young age is a very impressive feat. Don't look down on yourself, Zhang Jiazhen." The young boy looked up. Chen Pingan smiled and asked, "Did you give yourself the name Jiazhen after looking at the many stone tablets and choosing these two characters?" The young boy nodded and replied, "My parents passed away early, and my grandpa isn't literate, so I only had a nickname in the beginning." Chen Pingan looked at him and said, "Jia means beautiful, and Zhen means determination. This is a very good name. Life is full of hardships at the Sword Qi Great Wall, but this is something beyond your control, so you can only accept your fate. However, how you live life is something you can control. It's difficult to say whether things will improve in the future, and you might face even more difficulties and hardships. Or perhaps your skills will improve in the future, and you'll earn more money at work, becoming a craftsman respected by everyone in this neighborhood." After saying this, Chen Pingan turned around and continued with a smile, "At the very least, however, I might mention to other people that there's a craftsman called Zhang Jiazhen at the Sword Qi Great Wall Spirit Rhino Alley when I tell stories about mountains and rivers in the future. Perhaps this person doesn't have any skills apart from his craft, but he has always liked to observe stone tablets and learn characters from a young age, with his diligence no inferior to scholarly students." Guizhuzhou had remained silent from the beginning to the end, but after Zhang Jiazhen left, she simply looked up at the young man who would become her master in 1.5 years. Her big eyes were filled with anticipation at this moment. However, Chen Pingan performed some calculations on his fingers before saying, I still need to wait 1.5 years before taking you as a disciple. Guizhuzhou heaved a heavy sigh. Chen Pingan continued to walk forward, looking at the bustling wine shop where money was flowing into his pockets like water. It looked delightful even from a distance, and Chen Pingan was in a fairly good mood as he casually asked, Have you heard of this saying before? Only a world rife with evils can nurture a poet whose works are remembered for eternity. Guizhuzhou shook her head and replied, Future master is very knowledgeable, while this future disciple lacks knowledge. I've never heard this saying before. Chen Pingan was quite puzzled. Had the atmosphere of his downtrodden mountain already spread to the Sword Qi Great Wall? This surely couldn't be the case. His opening disciple, the main culprit, as well as Zhu Lian and the others were all very far away from here. Is there more to this saying? Guizhuzhou asked in curiosity. Chen Pingan nodded and replied, The most celebrated and timeless poems are nothing much, and all of you who have lived here for tens of thousands of years, generation after generation, bring enough shame to embarrass to death all of the poems in the world. Master, should I help you shout this saying across all of the streets and alleys? Guizhuzhou asked. This disciple of yours can shout this saying as I practice walking meditation and fist techniques. I won't feel tired. Please don't, Chen Pingan replied in exasperation. Guizhuzhou felt secretly delighted. She had spoken tactically just then, referring to herself as a disciple and referring to Chen Pingan as master. She had enjoyed a huge win today. When they arrived at the wine shop, Ningyao looked at the young girl who was about to run away, and Guizhuzhou giddily ran over to Ningyao and chuckled. Big sister Ning looks especially beautiful today. Ningyao shot a glance at Chen Pingan. I didn't teach her these things, Chen Pingan said with a bitter smile. Seeing that big sister Ning wasn't going to beat her up today, Guizhuzhou seized this rare opportunity to pipe down and go home. When one was little, one would feel like there were many big matters to worry about. When one grew up, one would completely forget about these past worries. Ningyao and Chen Pingan returned to the Ning residence. Do you really plan to take her as a disciple? Ningyao asked. Chen Pingan nodded and replied, Unofficially for the moment. The Gua clan has been kind and sincere, and this is a rare chance for me to do something for the Ning residents. Wei Jin had entered the wine shop to drink at some unknown time, and he seemingly remembered something at this moment, turning around to look at Chen Pingan's back as he chuckled and said using his mind's lake, I was too focused on drinking the previous few times, so I forgot to pass along a message that seniors would task me with delivering a long time ago. When are you going to start sword technique training? Chen Pingan turned to Daizhong and hollered, Shopkeeper, remember to give Great Sword Immortal Wei -10% off whenever he comes here to drink in the future. Wei Jin retrieved a grain rain coin and placed it on the table saying, Easy done. What's wrong? Ningyao asked. I need to visit the Sword Qi Great Wall straight away, Chen Pingan replied with a wry smile. Ask Grandma Bai to prepare a medicinal bath for me, and if I still haven't returned late at night, then you need to come over and carry me back. Die. Over at the Sword Qi Great Wall, Zuiyu was facing south as he sat cross-legged, with his eyes closed as he rested his mind. There were many things that Zuiyu didn't understand, and even if he understood some of them, he wasn't willing to accept them. And thus, he ultimately chose solitude, choosing to distance himself from the matters of the mortal world and flying toward the sea on his sword. This wasn't an act relating to the carefree and dashing demeanor of a sword immortal, and in reality, it wasn't relaxing and leisurely at all. At this moment there was an additional matter that Zuiyu didn't understand. How was his junior brother still so daring, even though their master wasn't present?